Hey hey. Welcome back to Arcane Paradox. We've got something fire today. What if Harry sent his Hogwarts medical records to the Muggle police and had the Dursleys prosecuted? Likes and subs keep us going. Alright, story time. Chapter 1, The records. The thing about Madame Pomfrey was that she talked to herself when she thought no one was listening. Harry had figured this out in his second year, after the Whomping Willow had introduced itself to his arm in the most aggressive way possible. He'd lain in the hospital wing for 2 days while Skeelgrow rebuilt his bones from nothing, and in between the waves of grinding, architectural pain, he'd listened to Pomfrey mutter under her breath as she moved between beds, cataloging symptoms, cross-referencing treatments, occasionally offering her personal opinion on the intelligence of students who thought it was a good idea to stand directly beneath a tree that was known to punch people. He hadn't thought about it since. It was just one of those things you filed away and forgot. Until the Wednesday in October of his 5th year when he walked into the hospital wing with a split lip courtesy of a particularly vicious Quidditch practice. Lee Jordan had taken a bludger to the shoulder and gone sideways off his broom into Harry at speed, and Harry had met the ground face first, and Pomfrey wasn't at her desk. The ward was empty, the curtains pulled back from the neat rows of white-sheeted beds. The afternoon light came through the high windows in long pale slabs. Harry pressed the back of his wrist against his mouth and wandered further in, figuring she'd be in the back storeroom where she kept the more serious potions. He was right. He could hear her voice through the half-open door, low and rapid, and the scratch of a quill on parchment. Left radius, 3rd documented fracture, see entries from July of 92 and again August 93, pattern consistent with, a pause. The sound of pages turning. Yes, consistent with repeated blunt trauma. Note for the record, patient has never provided satisfactory explanation for origin. Each time, attributed to, another pause, and then something in her voice shifted, something that wasn't quite clinical anymore, to his own clumsiness. Harry stopped walking. The storeroom door was open about 4 inches. He could see a slice of Pomfrey's profile, her sharp nose, the white cap she always wore, the tight set of her jaw. She was bent over a large leather-bound file, her quill moving in quick, precise strokes. Notation also required for height and weight records, years 1 through 4, she continued, as if reciting for a report she didn't want to be writing. Patient presented consistently below the expected range for his age group. Year 1, see admission physical, 9 standard deviations below weight average for an 11-year-old male. Malnutrition indicators present. Noted. Reported to. She stopped. Actually stopped, mid-sentence, and for a moment there was only the sound of a candle guttering somewhere in the storeroom. Reported to the headmaster. November 1991. No subsequent action recorded. She set the quill down. Picked it up again. Harry realized he had stopped breathing. He didn't make a decision, exactly. It was more like his body made it for him, the way his hand had once shot out to catch Neville's remembrall without him thinking about it at all. He pushed the door open. Pomfrey looked up with the expression of someone expecting a first year with a potion burn. When she saw Harry, the expression collapsed into something much more complicated. Mr. Potter. She straightened immediately, her shoulders squaring with automatic professional dignity. I didn't hear you come in. Sit down, I'll see to your. Her eyes went to his split lip. Sit down. Is that my file? Harry said. The question came out very flat. Not accusing. Just flat, the way things came out when you were keeping your voice steady by sheer concentrated effort. Pomfrey looked at the leather-bound file, then at him. She was a practical woman who had been a healer for 37 years, and she understood that there were moments when the carefully maintained pretense that everything was fine became not only useless but actively cruel. He could see her making that calculation. Sit down, Mr. Potter, she said, but gently this time. Can I see it? Sit down. He sat. She brought him a damp cloth for his lip without being asked, and while he held it to his face she stood at her dispensing counter with her back to him for a moment, just long enough to make some private decision. Then she picked up the file and set it on the bed beside him. "I'll be at my desk," she said. "You have 20 minutes before my evening rounds." She walked out. He heard her chair scrape in the main ward, and then the deliberate, pointed sound of quill meeting parchment, telling him, in the clearest possible terms, that she was not watching. Harry opened the file. He had always known, in the vague and distant way that you know things you've never examined directly, that his childhood had not been normal. He knew it the way you know a room in your house has a smell, you stop noticing it because you've always lived with it, but visitors clock it immediately. What he had not understood, until this moment, was what it looked like from the outside. The file was organized chronologically, beginning with his admission physical in September 1991 and running forward. Each entry was dated, signed, and written in Madame Pomfrey's meticulous clinical hand. Some entries were short: a sprained wrist, a transfiguration mishap, a mild fever in February of third year. Those entries looked like what he'd always assumed the whole file would look like. Normal. Unremarkable. But there were other entries. The first one that stopped him was from November 1991, 2 months into his first year. He had no memory of going to the hospital wing that November. He flipped back to it and read, "Patient presented following routine year group health screening. Height and weight measurements recorded significantly below established norms for age. Patient is 11 years, 2 months. Weight, 29.4 kilograms. Expected range for age and height, 35 to 42 kilograms. Pallor noted. Mild iron deficiency markers present. Patient initially resistant to examination, displayed notable startle response when healer moved without warning. Patient states he is fine and has always been this way. Healer's note, pattern of weight deficiency and startle response inconsistent with standard childhood illness. Recommend nutritional support and follow-up assessment. Concern flagged to Headmaster APWB Dumbledore via internal correspondence dated November 12, 1991. Harry read that last line twice. Then he kept going. There were 7 entries like that one across 4 years. Not dramatic. Not the ones where he'd arrived in the hospital wing half dead from one thing or another, the basilisk, the dementors, the Triwizard Tournament. Those entries were present too, and they were detailed and grave in their own way. But these 7 quiet entries were different. They were the ones that recorded, without drama, the evidence of 10 years of number 4, Privet Drive. The notations on his arm, 3 fractures of the left radius, the small bones of the wrist, over 3 years. Each one attributed in Harry's own words to falling, to running into things, to Quidditch. Each one followed by a healer's note that said, in increasingly direct clinical language, that the pattern was inconsistent with accidental injury. A note from second year about old scar tissue on his back, from when, Harry thought distantly. He genuinely wasn't sure which incident it referred to. That was its own kind of information. The weight charts, year after year. The measurements. The iron levels. The note in third year that read, patient's baseline cortisol indicators suggest chronic stress exposure. Not incidental. Recommend psychological assessment. Reported to Headmaster, October 14, 1993. No action recorded. No action recorded. The phrase appeared 4 times in the file. Sometimes varying slightly, no follow-up documented. No external referral made. No response received to healer's correspondence. But always the same essential sentence. Pomfrey had flagged it. She had written it down, filed it, sent memos. And every single time, nothing had happened. Harry sat there with the file open on his knees for a long time. The afternoon light shifted. At some point, the cloth against his lip went cold, and he didn't move it. The thing was, he wasn't surprised. That was what got him, sitting there in the quiet hospital wing with his own medical history laid out in ink. He wasn't surprised. He had expected the dismissal, the non-response, the careful bureaucratic nothing. He had grown up expecting it. He had spent 14 years being told, in 100 different ways, that what happened to him was either his fault or his problem or, at best, an unfortunate but necessary arrangement. But seeing it written down was different from knowing it. Seeing it written down made it real in a different way. Made it a thing that had happened, that had been observed, that had been deemed not worth addressing. Not once, but 7 times. By an adult whose literal professional responsibility was to protect the health of children in her care, who had done everything she could do within her remit and had been ignored every single time. He was still sitting there when Pomfrey came back. She looked at his face for a moment and then sat down on the bed across from him, which she had never done in his entire 5 years at Hogwarts. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. "You sent memos to Dumbledore," Harry said. "Yes. Every time." "Yes. And nothing happened." She didn't look away from him. That was the thing about Pomfrey, she was not a woman who looked away. "No. Nothing happened." Harry nodded slowly. There was something happening in his chest that he couldn't quite name, not anger, not grief, not exactly either of those things. More like the feeling of a lock turning. A mechanism releasing that he hadn't known was engaged. "Can I have a copy of this?" he said. Pomfrey was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the file, and then at Harry, and he could see her working through it, what it meant, what he might do with it, what her obligations were and where they sat in relation to each other. "You are entitled to your own medical records," she said carefully. "Under standard healer's ethics as established by the British Magical Medical Board, a patient aged 15 and above may request access to and copies of their own file." "Right," Harry said. "I can prepare a full copy," she said, still in that careful tone. "It would take me until tomorrow evening." "That's fine. Mr. Potter." She paused. "Whatever you're thinking, I'm not thinking anything yet," Harry said honestly. That was true. He wasn't. He was just sitting with the weight of it for now, getting used to it, the way you got used to the feel of something heavy in your hands. He found Hermione in the library, which was where she always was on Wednesday evenings, with a stack of books at her left elbow and a system of color-coded notes that Harry had given up trying to understand in second year. She had a jar of Muggle highlighters, imported specifically for the purpose, and she was working her way through what looked like a very long essay on the properties of magical contract law. Harry sat down across from her and didn't say anything for about 30 seconds. Hermione looked up on the second, registered that it was him, registered his expression, and put her highlighter down. "What happened?" she said. He told her. He started with walking into the hospital wing and ended with Pomfrey's offer to copy the file, and through all of it Hermione sat very still with her hands flat on the table in front of her. This was her listening posture, the one that meant she was taking in every word and cross-referencing it simultaneously with everything she already knew. When he finished she was quiet for a moment. 7 separate flags, she said. All unanswered. Yeah. And the fractures, 3 of them, same arm, over 3 years. Yeah. Harry. She looked at him steadily. You know what that is. I know what it is. No, I mean, she stopped, and something flickered across her face that wasn't quite the logical precision he was used to seeing there. Something more raw than that. I mean the Muggle terminology. What Madame Pomfrey has documented. The weight charts, the recurring injuries, the stress indicators. That's a clinical picture of child abuse. That's what it looks like in a case file. Harry looked at his hands. I know. And Dumbledore knew. Not suspected. Knew. He hadn't said that explicitly, but hearing her say it made it land differently. Yeah. He knew. The library was quiet around them, the vast comfortable dark of evening settling over the bookshelves. Somewhere near the restricted section, Madame Pants was doing her evening shelving with the grim efficiency of a general managing a small war. A first year at a nearby table was asleep over a book about goblin rebellions. Hermione picked up a fresh piece of parchment. This was also a thing she did. The moment she identified a problem worth solving, her hands went automatically to writing materials. It was practically a reflex. "There's something you should know," she said, and her voice had shifted into the careful tone she used when she'd thought something through and wasn't sure how Harry was going to react to the conclusion. Muggle law. Specifically, the Children Act 1989, and the Child Protection Frameworks under Surrey County Council Social Services. She looked up at him. "I've read about cases like this." Not your case, but cases like it. The documentation that Madame Pomfrey has built up, if it could be presented to a Muggle authority. A social worker. The police. Harry looked at her. They'd have no way to verify any of it. It's from a magical school. Right, but, she was already writing, her quill moving fast. The records themselves are internally consistent. If we translated the language. Removed the magical terminology. The patterns are the patterns regardless of where the original documentation comes from. And the Dursleys aren't wizards. They can't claim magical immunity. They're Muggle residents of a Muggle street in a Muggle county, subject to Muggle law. The thing clicked into place so clearly that Harry felt it almost physically. Hermione. I know. Could that actually work? I don't know yet. She said it with complete honesty, which was one of the things he liked most about her. She never pretended to certainty she didn't have. But I want to find out. And I think, she paused, looking at what she'd written. I think the more important question is, do you want to try? He thought about the file. About Pomfrey's phrase, repeated 4 times like a chorus. No action recorded. Yes, he said. Ron found them in the common room at 11:30 that night, when the rest of Gryffindor had gone to bed and the fire had burned down to a comfortable mumble of orange. He'd come down for water after a bad dream. He was having a lot of those since the end of 4th year, since the graveyard, since the way Harry had come back through the portkey holding Cedric's body, and stopped at the bottom of the stairs when he saw the 2 of them at the table near the window with Hermione's notes spread out between them. Okay, he said. What are we doing? Harry looked up. Ron was in an old t-shirt and worn pajama bottoms, his hair doing the thing it did at night where it looked like a creature had built a nest in it. He looked at the parchment, then at Harry's face. Are you all right? He said, more quietly. Sit down, Harry said. I need to explain some things. So he did. Ron sat across from him and listened with his elbows on the table, not interrupting once, which was unusual enough that Harry noticed it. When he finished, Ron was quiet for a moment, his jaw working slightly in the way that usually meant he was figuring out what he actually thought before he said anything. I knew it was bad, Ron said at last. Like, I always knew it was bad there. But I didn't, he shook his head. I didn't know it was that. I didn't exactly advertise it. No, I know, Ron glanced at Hermione, something passing between them, and then back at Harry. I'm sorry I never asked. Harry didn't know what to do with that, so he looked down at the parchment in front of him. Hermione thinks we might be able to use the records. How? Hermione explained. She'd been at this for 3 hours now and her explanation was sharper than it had been at the start, the argument honed down to its essential components. The records. The Muggle legal framework. The translated documentation. The Surrey police. Ron listened to all of it, and at the end he said, so Dumbledore could try to stop it. He could try, Hermione said. But he can't obliviate the Muggle police. No. He can't make them forget the file exists, or pressure them the way he can pressure the Ministry. The Muggle police, Hermione said, with a kind of careful precision, are entirely outside his sphere of influence. He has no standing there. No history. No political capital. He's not the chief warlock in Surrey. Ron looked at Harry. Then I think you should do it. There was something in the way he said it, not excited, not strategizing, just direct and clear, that meant more to Harry than almost anything else that had happened that day. "Yeah," Harry said. "I think so too." Pomfrey delivered the copied file the following evening, as promised. She brought it to Harry personally, in a brown envelope that she'd sealed with a healer's stamp, and she handed it over without ceremony in the corridor outside the Great Hall while students streamed past them in both directions after dinner. "This is a certified copy," she said quietly. "My signature on every page. The notation on the cover references the date of copying and confirms it is a true reproduction of your original file." She paused. "If anyone ever attempts to suggest these records were fabricated, I know," Harry said. "Thank you." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read, not quite guilt, not quite pride. Something that had been under pressure for a long time and had finally been allowed to move. "I should have done more," she said. It wasn't an apology exactly. It was a statement of fact, offered without deflection. "You flagged it 7 times, Harry said. "To the wrong person." He didn't argue with that. "Well," he said, "I'm going to flag it to the right ones." He tucked the envelope under his arm and walked away. The translation process took Hermione 4 days. The challenge, as she explained it to Harry with the focused intensity of someone who had fallen slightly in love with a problem, was threefold. First, all references to magic had to be removed or reframed. Madame Pomfrey, school healer at Hogwarts boarding school, Inverness, Scotland. Instead of whatever the truth was, the injuries described in terms of physical impact rather than bludgers or whomping willows or anything else that would require explanation. Second, the clinical language needed to remain intact, because it was the clinical language that made the records credible, the weight charts, the cortisol notation, the healer's flags. Those were the things that a Muggle doctor, or a Muggle police officer, would recognize immediately. Third, and most delicate, the file needed to be internally consistent with the timeline of Harry's life in a way that a Muggle could verify. Age, dates, the address at Privet Drive. These were real. These were checkable. "There's a risk," Hermione said on the second evening, sitting on the common room floor with the file and 3 law books spread around her. "If anyone does a deep check on the school, tries to find Hogwarts in official records, it won't be there. It's not registered anywhere Muggles can find it," Harry said. "I know. But," she chewed her lip. "Private boarding schools are sometimes not on standard Muggle registries. And we have corroborating evidence, your injuries. The documentation is consistent with physical examination of you. If they examine you, they'll find evidence of everything in the file," Harry said. The sentence sat in the room for a moment. Ron, from the armchair behind Hermione, shifted but didn't say anything. "Yes," Hermione said softly. "They will." She went back to writing. On the 4th day she produced a document of 32 pages. It was clean, precise, formatted in a way that Hermione explained was consistent with how a private medical practice would present records to a third party. She'd cross-referenced it with Muggle Child Protection Guidelines, NHS documentation standards, and 2 case reports she'd found in the Hogwarts library's small but surprisingly comprehensive Muggle law section. "The cover letter," she said, handing Harry a separate single page. "I drafted it. But it should be in your words." He read her draft. She'd written it in careful, formal English, setting out who he was, where he lived, what he was sending, and what he was asking the recipient to do with it. The language was measured and specific without being cold. It was, Harry thought, the most effective piece of writing he'd ever read. "You need to write it," she said again. "Not me. It needs to be from you. They need to know a real 15-year-old boy sat down and wrote this." Harry rewrote it in his own hand that night, in the emptied common room after midnight, with Ron asleep in the armchair and Hermione dozing over her books. He kept most of her structure and changed the language to sound like himself, not formal, not perfectly constructed, but clear. He said who he was. He said what the records showed. He said he was a student at a boarding school and had been for 4 years, and that in those 4 years his school's medical staff had documented what they believed was a pattern of abuse, and had reported it internally with no result. He said he was now reporting it himself, to the appropriate Muggle authority. He said, "I am not asking you to take my word for anything. The records speak for themselves. I am asking you to look at them." He signed it Harry James Potter, age 15, student, and wrote his address, both of them, Hogwarts and Privet Drive. He sat back and looked at it for a long time. Ron stirred in the armchair and cracked one eye open. "Done." "Yeah. Is it good?" "I think so." Ron was quiet for a moment. "Are you scared?" Harry thought about it genuinely, which felt important. The easy answer was no. The true answer was more complicated. He wasn't scared of what would happen to the Dursleys, and he wasn't scared of Dumbledore, and he wasn't scared of whatever blowback came from the wizarding world when they found out. What he was scared of was something smaller and harder to name. The possibility that nothing would happen. That the Muggle system would do what every other system had done and find a way to decide that Harry Potter's pain was acceptable collateral. "A bit," he said. "Me too," Ron said, which surprised him enough that he looked over. Ron shrugged. "I mean it. What they did to you, and no one did anything. That's terrifying. Makes you wonder what else people just," he stopped. "Anyway. I think it'll work." "Hermione thinks it'll work." "Right, well, Hermione thinks everything she plans will work, but she's also usually correct, so." Ron settled back in the armchair. "Send it." They sent it on a Saturday morning, from Hogsmeade, using a Muggle post office in the village's small and perpetually confused Muggle-facing High Street. Hermione had looked up the address, Surrey Police, Non-Emergency Correspondence, Child Protection Unit, and addressed the envelope in Harry's handwriting. Harry stood at the post office counter with the envelope in his hand and felt very strange. Not afraid, exactly. Not triumphant. Something between the two, something that hadn't got a proper name yet. "You don't have to," Hermione said quietly, beside him. "I know," he said. He put it through the slot. The thing about the post office was that it was completely mundane. No flash of light. No dramatic moment. A Saturday morning post office in a Hogsmeade High Street, a young man in glasses and a worn jacket, an envelope. But Harry stood there for a moment after he'd let go of it, with his hand still by the slot, and felt the lock in his chest turn another notch. Something that had been closed for 15 years opening slowly, grudgingly, into air. "Right," Ron said, from his other side. "Butterbeers. I think we've earned it." Hermione made a noise that might have been a laugh or a sob and was possibly both, and the three of them walked out of the post office into the thin October sunshine, and Harry breathed in the cold Highland air, and for the first time in a very long time he felt like something had started. Not finished. Not resolved. The Dursleys were still in their house on Privet Drive. Dumbledore was still in his tower. The world was still exactly what it had been an hour ago. But something had started. And Harry had been the one to start it. That felt, he thought, like enough for now. Chapter 2, Privet Drive, interrupted. The letter arrived at Surrey Police's Child Protection Unit on a Tuesday. Detective Sergeant Claire Marsh found it in the Tuesday morning pile, which was always the worst pile because it collected everything that had come in over the weekend plus Monday's overflow, and it sat between a noise complaint that had been misfiled from a different department and a letter from a man in Guildford who was convinced his neighbor was running an illegal ferret breeding operation. She almost didn't open it. What made her open it first, over everything else, was the handwriting on the envelope. It was a teenager's handwriting. She had 3 nephews and she knew it when she saw it, careful and slightly uneven, the letters of someone who had thought hard about making this legible. Not a grown adult writing on a child's behalf. The child had written it themselves. She slid it open and read the cover letter standing at her desk, still in her coat. Then she sat down. She read it again. Then she opened the envelope fully and extracted the 32 pages inside, and she read those too, from the beginning, with her coat still on and her morning coffee going cold beside her keyboard and her colleague D.S. Peters talking on the phone 10 feet away about something involving a school liaison visit that she stopped hearing after the first page. The records were, on the surface, unusual. The school, Hogwarts, some private institution up in Scotland that she'd never heard of but that wasn't itself suspicious. There were hundreds of private schools that never appeared on any standard registry, had a medical format she didn't recognize exactly, but the clinical language was familiar enough. Weight charts. Injury logs. The healer's flags that translated cleanly into what any doctor would call safeguarding concerns. 3 fractures of the left arm over 3 years. Each one documented. Each one followed by a note about inconsistent explanation. Weight measurements that, converted to standard NHS charts, placed a healthy young boy somewhere around the 3rd percentile for his age group in year 1. 2nd year slightly better. 3rd year better again. The school environment, clearly, was doing what the home environment was not. She turned to page 14, which was the first of the healer's direct observations about the home address. Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Very local. Less than 40 minutes drive. Patient's account of summer holiday period consistently differs in tone and detail from account of school term. During school term, patient's baseline indicators improve across all markers. Weight, sleep quality per self-report, cortisol levels, behavioral presentation. During examination following each return from summer break, deterioration is marked and consistent. Marsh underlined that sentence. Then she underlined the one that followed it. This pattern has been documented across 4 consecutive academic years. The consistency is not consistent with accidental variation or illness. It is consistent with a child who is safer in one environment than in another, and who returns each summer to the less safe one. She turned to the back of the file, where the healer's summary notation was, and read it twice. Then she picked up the cover letter and read that again too. I am not asking you to take my word for anything. The records speak for themselves. I am asking you to look at them. Marsh looked at her colleague, who had finished his phone call and was now eating a biscuit over his keyboard with the casual indifference of a man who had not just read what she'd read. Peters, she said. Clear your Thursday afternoon. At number 4, Privet Drive, a Thursday afternoon in late October was a thoroughly predictable thing. Vernon left for Grunnings at 7:30, returned at 6, expected dinner on the table and the evening news on the television and no surprises of any kind. Petunia kept the house. Dudley was at school. This particular Thursday was therefore proceeding exactly as every other Thursday had proceeded for the past 20-odd years, which was precisely the way Vernon liked it, until Petunia looked out the kitchen window at 2:30 and saw the car. It was an ordinary car. A dark blue Vauxhall, slightly battered, parked across the road and slightly up from the house. She noticed it because it wasn't one of the neighbors' cars. She knew every car on this street, had catalogued them over 17 years, and because the 2 people getting out of it were not the kind of people who came to Privet Drive for pleasant reasons. She could tell that from 60 feet through a kitchen window. Something in the purposefulness of how they moved, the way the woman, 30s, sensible shoes, the kind of face that didn't waste expressions, looked at the house number as she crossed the road. Petunia set down her tea and straightened her blouse. She had the door open before they reached the path. This was her instinct: meet things at the door, don't let them come to you. Control the threshold. Mrs. Dursley. The woman. She had a badge out already, held at a courteous but readable angle. D.S. Clare Marsh, Surrey Police. This is my colleague, D.C. Franklin. I wonder if we might come in. Petunia looked at the badge with the precise expression of someone who has been rehearsing for a possibility they hoped would never arrive. What's this about? We'd rather speak inside, if you don't mind. Is it about an accident? Has something happened to my husband? Nothing like that, Marsh said. Not unkindly, but not softly either. We're from the Child Protection Unit. We'd like to speak with you about your nephew, Harry Potter. The name landed in the space between them like a stone into still water. Petunia watched D.S. Marsh's face very carefully in the 2 seconds that followed, and D.S. Marsh watched hers, and they both saw what they needed to see. "Of course," Petunia said. "Come in." The sitting room of number 4 was immaculate in the way of a room that had never been used for anything spontaneous. The 3-piece suite matched the curtains which matched the throw cushions which matched the framed print above the fireplace in a coordinated scheme that had been selected from a catalogue in 1987 and not deviated from since. A family portrait on the mantel, Vernon, Petunia, Dudley, arranged in descending order of enthusiasm. No photograph of Harry. Marsh noted that immediately. Filed it without expression. She sat on the edge of the sofa with D.C. Franklin to her left, his notebook open, and watched Petunia Dursley settle into the armchair across from her with the posture of a woman who had grown up sitting very straight and had never found a reason to stop. "Would you like tea?" Petunia said. "No, thank you." Marsh opened her folder on her lap. "Mrs. Dursley, we've received documentation regarding your nephew Harry Potter, who I understand has lived in this household since the age of 1. "That's correct. Currently aged 15. A student at a boarding school in Scotland." "Yes. Before he started school, and during school holidays, he lived here full-time. He's been very well cared for," Petunia said. The speed of it was telling. It came out before any question had been asked that required it. "That's what we're here to talk about," Marsh said. She kept her voice neutral, conversational almost. "We've received medical records from Harry's school, his health records going back to when he first enrolled at age 11. I have them here." She didn't produce the file yet. Just mentioned it. Watched Petunia's hands on the arms of the chair. "The records show some things that concern us. Concerns that have apparently been raised before, through internal channels, without any follow-up. Harry is a clumsy boy," Petunia said. "He always has been. Always knocking into things, falling off his bicycle, 3 fractures of the left arm, Mrs. Dursley. Over 3 years. The same arm." Silence. "Children have accidents," Petunia said. "They do," Marsh agreed. "And some children have more accidents than others. What concerns us specifically is the documented pattern. The school's records show that Harry's physical condition, across multiple health markers, consistently declined during school holiday periods and improved during term time." She paused. "His weight in particular. His first examination at the school found him significantly underweight for his age. The records note that improved over his years there, but that each return from a summer here was accompanied by deterioration." Petunia's expression hadn't changed. It was a remarkable face for not changing, thin, sharp, the face of a woman who had survived a great deal by simply not reacting visibly. "We gave him everything he needed," she said. "What does that mean to you?" Marsh asked. "Everything he needed. A roof. Food. Clothing. A family." The words came out in the clipped rhythm of something well rehearsed. "His own room." A pause that was a fraction too long. "Of course. When did he move into his own room?" Another pause. "He's always, because the school records mention, in passing, that Harry described his room at home during a welfare check in his 2nd year. The description was noted by the school counselor. Shall I read it to you?" Marsh opened the folder and turned to a specific page, the passage she had flagged with a yellow tab. She read it without inflection. Patient describes sleeping in a small room under the stairs for the first 10 years of his life, approximately 6 feet by 4. No natural light. No heating. Limited ventilation. The sitting room was very quiet. Outside, a car went past on Privet Drive with the steady domestic ordinariness of a Tuesday afternoon. A neighbor's dog barked twice and stopped. "Children exaggerate," Petunia said. "They do," Marsh agreed again. "They also tell the truth. Mrs. Dursley, I want to be very clear about why we're here. We're not here to arrest anyone today. We're here to begin an assessment. These records have been officially received by our unit, they've been logged, and a case file has been opened. What happens next depends significantly on how cooperative you're willing to be." She paused. "Where is your husband today?" "At work. We'll need to speak with him as well. I'll leave a card. Could you ask him to call us when he's available?" Petunia looked at the business card Marsh set on the coffee table. "I'd like to know who sent these records." "I can't share that with you. He's a minor. Surely his guardian has the right." "His guardian doesn't have the right to know the identity of someone who reports a safeguarding concern. That's protected." Marsh closed the folder. "Mrs. Dursley, is your son home this afternoon?" "Dudley?" Something moved behind Petunia's eyes. "He's at school. We'll need to speak with him as well. As a witness to the household dynamics. Standard procedure in any child protection assessment." She stood. Franklin stood with her. "Thank you for your time. We'll be in touch about next steps. Please don't contact Harry directly in the meantime." Petunia stood too, very controlled, very straight. "He is our family. We have a right, you have the right to legal representation, which I would suggest obtaining promptly." Marsh's voice was still conversational, but there was something in it now like a door that had been gently and definitively closed. "We'll see ourselves out." She left the business card on the coffee table. Petunia stared at it for a long time after the front door clicked shut. Upstairs, unnoticed, Dudley Dursley had come home from school 40 minutes early with a headache and had been lying on his bed listening to every word through the floor. The owl arrived in the hospital wing at Hogwarts at 6:17 in the morning, 2 days after the visit to Privet Drive, which meant someone had sent it urgently overnight. Harry was not in the hospital wing. He was in the dormitory, which was where you were meant to be at 6:17 in the morning, and would have been perfectly happy to stay there if Neville hadn't shaken his shoulder and said in a nervous whisper that Madame Pomfrey was at the portrait hole asking for him. He pulled on jeans and a jumper and went down. Pomfrey was in the corridor, which was unusual. She had the unmistakable look of someone who had been awake for a while and was maintaining composure by willpower alone. She held a sealed letter. "This came for you," she said. "It's official." He looked at it. Standard Muggle envelope, his name and the Hogwarts address written in a cramped, formal hand. In the top left corner, Surrey Police, Child Protection Unit. His heart did something complicated. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once and walked away without making it into a moment, which he appreciated. He opened it leaning against the cold stone wall of the corridor with the portrait hole swinging gently behind him. The letter was 2 pages, official headed paper, and it said several things, of which the most significant were, 1, that the Child Protection Unit of Surrey Police had received his correspondence and the accompanying documentation, had reviewed both, and had formally opened a case file. 2, that an initial visit to the address at Privet Drive had been conducted and further investigation was underway. 3, that Harry, as the named individual in the complaint and as the young person at the center of the case, was entitled to speak with an officer and a designated social worker assigned to his case, and that arrangements could be made to facilitate this at a location convenient to him. 4, and this was the part that he read 3 times, a family court welfare officer has been assigned to your case. Under Section 47 of the Children Act 1989, we have a statutory duty to make inquiries where we have reason to believe a child may have suffered or be at risk of suffering significant harm. The documentation you provided, in conjunction with the initial assessment visit, has met the threshold for a formal Section 47 inquiry. He stood in the corridor and breathed. Section 47. He didn't know what that meant exactly, but the phrase statutory duty landed with a weight that felt important. Not discretionary. Not a favor. A duty. Something they were required to do, regardless of whether it was convenient or whether it upset anyone important. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his back pocket and went back through the portrait hole. Ron was on the bottom step of the dormitory stairs in yesterday's socks, his hair at maximum chaos. Well? They opened a case, Harry said. Ron looked at him for a long moment. They actually did it. They actually did it. Across the room, Hermione appeared at the bottom of the girls' staircase in her dressing gown, took one look at both of them, and said, "Tell me everything." Dumbledore found out on a Friday. He found out the way Dumbledore generally found out things, not because anyone told him directly, but because he had maintained relationships with enough people in enough institutions that information had a tendency to route toward him. In this case, it came from Arabella Figg, who lived 3 streets from Privet Drive and had been keeping a quiet eye on the neighborhood for years. She had noticed the police car. Had noticed, with the experienced wariness of someone who had been doing covert observation for a long time, that it was not a routine visit. Had sent a letter to Dumbledore by Muggle post, she didn't keep owls, too conspicuous, that arrived on his desk Friday morning. He read it with the same measured stillness with which he read everything, and then he sat for a while looking out his office window at the grounds below, where a group of third years were doing something inadvisable with a levitation charm near the lake. After a time, he said, "Fawkes." The Phoenix looked up from his perch. "I believe," Dumbledore said, "that I have made some errors." Fawkes made a low sound that was not quite agreement and not quite absolution and was possibly both. Dumbledore called McGonagall to his office at 10 o'clock. She came in with a stack of essays she was marking, because she rarely went anywhere without something productive to do, and sat down across his desk with the brisk expectation of someone whose time was limited. "Albus. Sit down, Minerva. Put the essays down." She looked at his face and put the essays down. He told her what Arabella had written. He told her calmly, as was his habit, with his hands folded on the desk and his voice in its usual register of measured gravity. He watched McGonagall's expression as he spoke, and what he saw there was not surprise, and he had known it wouldn't be. He had sent her his own memos, once, years ago. She had flagged it too. He had told her it was managed, that he was monitoring the situation, that the protections required Harry to remain with the Dursleys and that this was not something that could be changed without significant risk. He had said that 5 years ago. Sitting now in his office, looking at McGonagall's face, he found the argument harder to make. "Harry sent the records," she said. "It would appear so. The records that Poppy, yes. Poppy flagged to you. 7 times. Yes." The silence in the office was not comfortable. The portraits on the wall were very still in the way they went still when they were listening hard. "Well," McGonagall said, after a pause that lasted about 4 seconds longer than her usual pauses. She picked up her essays again. Then she put them back down. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to speak with Harry." "And say what, exactly?" It was not a gentle question. McGonagall's not gentle questions had a particular quality: they didn't raise their voice, they didn't sharpen in pitch. They got very precise. "I'm going to explain the situation," Dumbledore said. "The blood protection. The reasons the arrangement with the Dursleys was necessary, was it?" she said. "Minerva, was it necessary?" She looked at him directly, the way she had looked at him a handful of times in 40 years of working together, when she had decided that the careful diplomatic maintenance of their relationship needed to be set aside for something more important. "Because I can tell you what I think, Albus, if you'd like. I think a great many things have been chalked up as necessary over the years that were, in fact, simply convenient. I think that boy has been," she stopped. "Reset. I think Harry has earned the right to make this decision without anyone framing it as a problem for him to reconsider." Dumbledore looked at her for a long time. "I'm not going to try to stop it, Minerva." "Good. But I do need to speak with him. There are things he doesn't know, things about why." "Then tell him those things," McGonagall said. "Don't use them to manage him. Tell him the truth and let him decide what to do with it." She picked up her essays for the 3rd time and stood. "I'll have him come to your office this afternoon," she said, at the door. "And Albus," she paused with her hand on the frame, and turned back just long enough to say what she clearly had been holding since the moment she sat down. "I am sorry I didn't push harder." She left. Dumbledore sat alone in his office for a while with the portraits very deliberately looking the other way. Harry came to the office at 4. He knocked, came in, sat down across from the vast desk, and looked at Dumbledore with the calm directness of someone who had already decided they weren't going to be talked out of anything. He looked, Dumbledore thought, older than he had 3 weeks ago. Not in a worrying way. In the way of someone who had put something down and not yet picked up the next thing, lighter, but also more alert. "You know," Harry said. "It wasn't a question. I've been informed, yes." "Right." Harry looked at him. "Are you going to tell me to stop it?" "No." Dumbledore said it without hesitation, because on this point, at least, his decision was clear. "I'm not." Something in Harry's shoulders eased very slightly, though he didn't look away. "But I want to speak with you," Dumbledore said, "about some things I should have told you sooner. About why you were placed with the Dursleys. About what I understood regarding conditions there, and what I told myself about it." He paused. "I'm not going to offer excuses. I want to be clear about that. What I'm going to offer is an explanation, which is not the same thing, and which I offer not to change your mind but because I believe you deserve to know." Harry said nothing. "The blood protection," Dumbledore said, "required you to live with family. Specifically with Petunia. It is, a very old magic, and while it protected you from Voldemort for 14 years, it required that you call that house home. The magic is tied to your acceptance of it, however reluctant." He looked at his hands. "I knew that the Dursleys were not, I knew they were not what I would have chosen for you, if protection had been my only consideration. I told myself that the protection outweighed the cost. I told myself that Poppy's concerns were being monitored, that you were resilient." He stopped. "I was wrong to let it continue as long as it did. I should have done more. I should have done a great deal more." Harry was quiet for a moment. He looked at the desk, then at Dumbledore. "Did you actually think I was fine?" he said. "Or did you just decide it was acceptable that I wasn't?" It was the most precise question anyone had asked him in 40 years of difficult conversations, and Dumbledore found, with the honesty of a man who had run out of comfortable untruths, that he couldn't answer it as cleanly as he wished. "I think," he said, "that I was afraid of the alternative. And that I made myself believe that fear was wisdom." Harry nodded slowly. He looked like he was filing that away, not forgiving it, not condemning it, just placing it accurately in its category and moving on. "The blood protection," Harry said. "If the Dursleys are prosecuted, if I get a new guardian, what happens to it? It will weaken. Possibly dissolve. You'll be 15 in July, and by then, Voldemort's already back," Harry said flatly. "The protection was already compromised the moment I came back from the graveyard. Wasn't it?" Dumbledore looked at him. "He touched me," Harry said. "He used my blood. Whatever the protection was, he's already through it. So the argument that I have to stay with the Dursleys for my own safety doesn't actually hold anymore." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "That is," he said carefully, "a sophisticated analysis." "Hermione helped," Harry said. There was something almost dry in it. "It is also," Dumbledore said, "correct." Harry stood up. He was not angry, which was almost more significant than if he had been. He was clear. "Then I'm going to keep going," he said. "Whatever you need to do on your end, that's your business. But I'm going to talk to the police and I'm going to let the case go forward." "I know," Dumbledore said. "And if the Ministry tries to interfere, I will not allow the Ministry to interfere in a Muggle legal proceeding." His voice, on that, was firm enough that Harry stopped. "That much I can do for you, Harry. And will." Harry looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded once, and left. Dumbledore turned to his window. The 3rd years had gone in. The lake was flat and still in the October dusk, and above it the sky was that particular dark blue of the highlands just before the light gave up entirely. He sat with what he had done, and what he had not done, for a very long time. Downstairs, in the Gryffindor common room, Harry dropped into his usual chair, and Ron passed him a butterbeer from the stash they kept charmed to temperature in the bottom of his trunk, and Hermione looked up from her book. "How'd it go?" Ron said. "He's not fighting it," Harry said. "Oh." Ron blinked. He admitted the blood protection argument doesn't work anymore." Hermione closed her book. Her expression was the one she wore when a hypothesis had been confirmed and she wasn't sure whether to feel vindicated or furious. "I thought as much. After the graveyard, yeah." Harry looked at the fire. "So. We keep going." "We keep going," Hermione agreed. Ron raised his butterbeer. It was a simple gesture, a little ridiculous, and precisely right for the moment. Harry and Hermione raised theirs. "To Surrey Police," Ron said, "who are apparently quite good at their jobs." "To D.S. Marsh," Harry said, who had read the name on the letter 3 times and was not going to forget it. "Whoever she is." They drank. Outside the common room tower windows, the October wind picked up off the lake and rattled the glass, and Harry sat in the warm light of the fire and felt, for the second time in 2 weeks, that something that had been a long time coming was finally, irrevocably, in motion. At number 4, Privet Drive, Vernon Dursley came home from work at 6 to find his wife standing in the kitchen with her arms folded and a business card on the coffee table and an expression he had only seen on her face twice before, when the letter from the school had first arrived 14 years ago, and on the night they'd found an infant on the doorstep. "Vernon," she said. "Sit down." He looked at the business card. "Read the words Child Protection Unit." The color, slowly and comprehensively, drained from his face. Upstairs, Dudley was in his room. He had not come down for dinner. He was sitting on his bed in the dark, thinking about a cupboard under the stairs, and a small boy with no birthday presents, and how he had laughed about it, and how that laughter felt now, 5 years later, in the stillness of a house that was no longer as safe as it used to be. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into its quiet Tuesday routine. Lawns trimmed. Curtains drawn. The sky going dark over the perfectly ordinary street. Number 4, Privet Drive, looked exactly as it always had. But the police had been. And they were coming back. Chapter 3, the room with the recorder. The solicitor's office was in Holborn, on a narrow street that smelled of coffee and exhaust fumes and the particular kind of London rain that couldn't quite commit to being a proper downpour. It occupied the second floor of a Georgian building that had been subdivided so many times it had lost any sense of its original self, and the waiting room had 3 chairs, a potted plant that was making a heroic effort to survive under fluorescent lighting, and a receptionist who offered Harry a glass of water with the practiced sympathy of someone who had seen a lot of young people sit in those chairs looking like he looked. He took the water. He didn't drink it. Hermione sat beside him with her hands in her lap, which meant she was restraining herself from producing notes. She had notes. He knew she had notes. They were in her bag and she was physically preventing herself from taking them out because she had promised Ron, who was on Harry's other side eating a packet of crisps with the focused application of someone who was managing his own anxiety through snacking, that she would not turn this into a study session. "They said 11, Ron said, looking at the clock above the receptionist's desk. "It's 5 past, Hermione said. "They're late." "They're 2 minutes late, Ron." "I'm just saying." "You've said." Harry looked at the potted plant and thought about nothing, which was a skill he had developed over years of living in a cupboard and had never quite lost. The trick was to not think about the room you were about to go into, or what you were about to do in it, or what it meant. You thought about the plant. The plant was doing its best. Harry respected the plant. A door opened and D.S. Marsh came out. She was shorter than he'd expected, which was not a rational thing to have expected anything about, and she was dressed practically, dark trousers, a jacket the color of a winter sky, sensible shoes that had seen a lot of ground. Her face was the face from the letter somehow, sharp and economical, with eyes that took him in quickly and completely in the way of someone who had trained the habit into a reflex. "Harry," she said, as if she wasn't certain it was him, which she clearly was. "Yeah," he said, and stood up. "Claire Marsh. Thanks for coming in." She looked at Ron and Hermione. "Your friends are welcome to wait here, we've got better chairs through the back, and the plant is considerably healthier." She said this last part completely straight, and Harry found, to his own faint surprise, that he liked her immediately. They know everything," Harry said. "Can they? The formal interview is just you and me and a social worker named Carol." She said it gently, not as a refusal. "But there's a room next door with a two-way monitor if they want to observe. No notes that are formally submitted, just support." She looked at Hermione. "Is that all right?" Hermione looked at Harry. He nodded. She said, yes, in a tone that meant she had already identified 6 objections and was choosing to hold all of them. "Great," Marsh said. "Come through." The interview room was smaller than he expected and less dramatic than the interrogation rooms he'd seen on the Dursleys television. No metal table. No single swinging bulb. Just a regular table, 4 chairs, a recording device that sat in the middle like a small grey referee, a box of tissues, and a window that looked out onto the narrow street below where London went about its business in complete indifference to whatever was happening inside. Carol was a social worker from Surrey Children's Services, mid-40s, reading glasses on a chain, the body language of someone who had done this many hundreds of times and had decided long ago that the most useful thing she could do was make the room feel ordinary. She introduced herself with a handshake and gestured to a chair and asked if he'd like tea as though they were about to discuss something unremarkable. "No thanks," Harry said, and sat down. Marsh set the recorder going and said the date and the time and the names of those present, and then she looked at Harry with the directness that he was already beginning to recognize as her particular mode of operating, not aggressive, not soft, just level. "Harry, I want to explain how this works before we start, so there are no surprises. This interview is part of a Section 47 inquiry, which means we have a statutory duty to investigate concerns about your welfare. You're not in trouble. You're not being questioned as someone who did anything wrong. You're here as the young person at the center of this, and you can stop at any time. You can ask for a break. You can ask me to rephrase something. If at any point you feel like you don't want to continue, we stop. Is that clear?" "Yes," Harry said. "Good." She opened a slim folder. "I've read your letter and the accompanying records multiple times. My colleague D.C. Franklin has also reviewed them. I want to say something before we begin, and I want it on the record." She paused, and the pause felt deliberate. "What you did, writing that letter, compiling those records, sending them through, that was a brave thing to do. I want you to know that it was taken seriously from the moment it arrived." Harry looked at the table for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Can you start by telling me about the house? Number 4, Privet Drive. In your own words, your own order. Just describe it." So Harry described it. He started at the beginning, which was the cupboard, because that was where his memory of that house started, not the layout of the rooms or the color of the carpet but the dimensions of the space under the stairs, the way the hot water pipe ran along one wall and burned if you rolled over in your sleep, the hook on the inside of the door that was too high for him to reach until he was about 8, the bolt on the outside that Vernon had installed when Harry was 4 and which had never needed explaining because who was going to ask? He described it the way you described a place you had memorized by living in it for a decade, not the way you described a place you were trying to make sound bad. He wasn't performing anything. He was just telling the truth about a cupboard, and the truth was specific and detailed and required no embellishment. Marsh listened. Carol wrote notes in a small pad. The recorder sat between them and took it all down. He talked for about 20 minutes about the first 10 years, and then paused. "Do you want a break?" Marsh said. "No," Harry said. "I'm fine. he looked at the window. I've never said all of it in order before. Take your time. I'm not upset, he said, which was approximately true in the way that technically accurate things could be approximately true. It's more like, I've thought about bits of it. But saying the whole thing from the start to now is different. Different how? It's a lot more than I remembered, he said. When you're in it, you don't add it up. You just live the next bit. Carol looked up from her notes, and something in her expression was very still and very careful. Yeah, Marsh said quietly. I know. Harry kept going. He told them about the second bedroom, the box room Dudley used for his overflow toys, that he'd been moved into before starting secondary school, though it had felt less like a gift and more like a strategic relocation because a boy of 11 showing up at school talking about his cupboard would have been awkward. He told them about the summer before Hogwarts, the letters, and Vernon's escalating panic and the systematic removal of food as punishment for things Harry hadn't done. He told them about the bars on the window of his room, which Vernon had installed as though it were a perfectly normal thing to do, with the casual confidence of a man who had never expected anyone to question him. He told them about the summer between second and third year, what he'd eaten and what he hadn't, and how much weight he'd lost, and how Madame Pomfrey had been the first person who'd ever taken a measurement of him and looked worried. He told them about the summer before fifth year, this summer, just gone, the Dementors and Dudley and the letter from the Ministry threatening expulsion, and Vernon's satisfaction at the prospect. He told them about Dudley's gang. He told them about being someone that children were paid in sweets to avoid. He told them about the specific and particular loneliness of a child who is told, not through cruelty exactly but through consistent daily practice, that he is less valuable than the furniture. He told them all of it. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Outside, London went on. A lorry went past on the street below. Marsh had stopped writing at some point and was just listening. Thank you, she said, after a moment. Is that what you needed? It's more than enough. She glanced at Carol, and something passed between them that Harry couldn't fully read. Harry, I want to ask you something that might feel strange, but it's important. When you sent those records, what did you want to happen? He hadn't expected that question. He thought about it honestly. I wanted someone to look at them, he said. I said that in the letter. But beyond that. He looked at the recorder. I wanted it to mean something. Everything that happened, it was all recorded, in Madame Pomfrey's file, but it was going nowhere. It was just, existing in a file. And I thought if I could get it to someone who was actually allowed to do something about it, then it would matter. Then it wouldn't just be a thing that happened to me that everyone decided was acceptable. Marsh nodded slowly. Do you want your aunt and uncle prosecuted? Yes, Harry said, without hesitation. Okay. She made a note. I want to be honest with you about the process, because you deserve to know what you're in for. Building a case like this takes time. The records are strong, they're excellent evidence, actually, in terms of documentary pattern. But the Crown Prosecution Service will want to corroborate them. They'll want to physically examine you. They'll want witness testimony. They'll potentially want your cousin interviewed. This will not be quick, and it will require you to stay involved throughout. Do you understand that? Yes. It's also going to get complicated in ways that might be uncomfortable. The Dursleys will have legal representation. They'll likely argue that the records are fabricated, or that the school is disreputable, or that Harry is a troubled young person with a grudge. She said it evenly, not cruelly, just as information. Are you prepared for that? Harry thought about Umbridge, and Voldemort's graveyard, and a Dementor in a narrow alley, and a basilisk in the dark. Yes, he said. Marsh almost smiled. It was a brief, contained thing, but it was there. Good. She clicked the recorder off. I'm going to get that tea now. Can I get you something? Yeah, actually, Harry said. Tea would be good. In the observation room next door, Ron had eaten the entire packet of crisps and was working on a second one that Hermione was pretending not to notice him producing from his pocket. They had watched through the window, not a two-way mirror exactly, more a glazed internal panel with a volume feed, and had heard everything. When the feed cut because Marsh switched the recorder off, they both sat with it for a moment. "I didn't know about the cupboard," Ron said. "I mean, I knew there was a cupboard. Third year, when we came to pick him up, I saw it had a lock on the outside. But I didn't know he'd lived in it." "For 10 years, Hermione said. "For 10 years. Hermione had a piece of parchment that she'd produced despite herself and had been making careful legal notes on for the past hour. She set it face down on the table. "Ron." "Yeah. When we go back in there, when Harry comes out, I think we just need to be normal. Don't make it into a thing." "I wasn't going to make it into a thing. You have your sympathy face on. This is my normal face." "It isn't, but I appreciate the effort." She looked at the window, where through the frosted glass she could see the shapes of Marsh and Carol and Harry, and the small gray rectangle of the recorder on the table. "He's going to be fine," she said, and it wasn't clear whether she was saying it to Ron or to herself or simply to the room. "Course he is," Ron said, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "He's Harry." The physical examination happened the following morning at a Muggle GP surgery in Guildford, with a pediatric specialist who had been contacted by Surrey Children's Services and who examined Harry with professional thoroughness and said very little for most of it, which Harry found he preferred to the alternative. The results went directly to D.S. Marsh. Harry received a summary letter 3 days later, which Hermione read first because Harry handed it to her without opening it, and then she summarized it for him in the kind of careful, factual language she used when she was managing the delivery of difficult information. The summary was this: the examination found evidence consistent with the documented records. Old healed fractures in his left arm. Markers consistent with childhood malnutrition that had partially resolved. Scar tissue in 2 locations on his back that the examining physician described as consistent with repeated impact over time. The physician's report concluded with the word that Hermione said twice when she read it, because it needed saying twice: corroborated. "That's good," Harry said. "It's very good," Hermione said. "For the case." "Yeah," he said. He looked at the fire. "For the case." She sat down next to him on the common room sofa and didn't say anything else, which was the right call. Ron, who had come in halfway through, sat on his other side, and the 3 of them sat there in the firelight for a while without it needing to be more than that. What Harry had not anticipated was the Wizarding World's reaction. He should have anticipated it. In retrospect, the signs were obvious: Dumbledore's careful silence, the way certain professors looked at him in the corridors with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite guilt and was possibly both, and the fact that the prophet had been getting increasingly agitated about something for the past 2 weeks without quite coming out and saying what. It came out on a Thursday when the morning owls arrived at breakfast and Hermione's copy of the Daily Prophet unfolded itself to a front page that read, in the prophet's signature enormous font, "Potter bypasses ministry. Boy who lived brings Muggle police into private family matter." The article underneath was a masterpiece of framing so breathtaking in its dishonesty that Harry almost admired it. It described the Dursleys as a respectable Muggle family who have given years of selfless care to the Wizarding World's most famous orphan. It described Harry's actions as a reckless escalation with dangerous implications for the statute of secrecy. Cornelius Fudge was quoted extensively about the deeply concerning precedent of involving Muggle law enforcement in what he termed internal matters. Seamus looked up from his own copy across the table. "They're calling it a statute of secrecy issue." "They can call it whatever they like," Harry said, reaching past the newspaper for the marmalade. "I mean, is it? Like, are you in trouble?" "No," Hermione said, in a tone that closed the topic with the efficiency of a door being firmly shut. The medical records were translated into Muggle-compliant language. No specific magical information was disclosed. The statute of secrecy pertains to the direct disclosure of magical existence to Muggles, not to reporting child abuse to the appropriate authorities. Did you check that? Dean asked. Extensively. Right. Dean looked at his eggs. Fair enough then. Harry ate his toast and did not read the article. The next problem arrived at 9:10, in the form of Dolores Umbridge. She was waiting outside the charms corridor with a clipboard and a smile that Harry had come to recognize as the expression a person wore when they had decided they had leverage. She was wearing an enormous bow in her hair, salmon pink, and her robes matched it, and she looked genuinely pleased in the way that small dangerous people looked pleased when they believed they had caught a large animal. "Mr. Potter," she said, in her soft high voice. "A moment, please." Harry stopped. Hermione and Ron stopped too, because they always stopped. "This concerns only Mr. Potter," Umbridge said, her eyes touching Ron and Hermione with the delicacy of someone removing something unpleasant. "That's fine," Harry said. "They can hear whatever you have to say." Her smile stayed exactly where it was. "I simply want to address the matter of your recent, extracurricular activities. The High Inquisitor has certain oversight responsibilities regarding student conduct, and I want to be sure you understand that actions which have the potential to embarrass the ministry. Are you threatening me?" Harry said. The smile tightened by about 3%. "I'm simply noting, because if you're threatening me, I want to be clear about something." Harry looked at her with the same level calm he'd used in Marcia's interview room. He wasn't angry. He was just clear, the way you were clear when you had already decided something and no one was going to undecide it for you. "What I've done is entirely legal. It's a Muggle legal process, it's protected under Muggle law, and the Ministry has no jurisdiction over it." Dumbledore confirmed that personally. Umbridge's nostrils narrowed slightly. "The Headmaster is not the final authority. D.S. Marsh has our address," Harry said. "Both our addresses. If anything interferes with this process, if I receive any formal pressure from any ministry official to withdraw my complaint, I will tell her that. In writing. With names." He looked at the clipboard. "Is that all you wanted to say?" The corridor was very quiet. A second year who had been walking past had stopped to listen with his mouth slightly open. Umbridge looked at Harry for a long moment with the expression of someone recalculating a problem and not liking the revised answer. Then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the stone, the bow on her head bouncing with each step. Ron let out a long slow breath. "Blimey. I had a speech ready," Hermione said, with mild disappointment. "Sorry," Harry said. "No, yours was better, I had one ready." "You can give it next time," Harry said. "There'll be a next time." The letter from Dudley arrived a week after the Holborn interview, addressed in a handwriting that Harry didn't recognize immediately and then did, the blocky, slightly uncertain print of someone who had never much practiced writing because there had always been something more immediately appealing to do. It was 3 paragraphs long. Harry read it twice in the corridor outside the Great Hall, then folded it very precisely and put it in his inside pocket, close to where he kept Marcia's business card. He told Hermione about it that evening, because he told Hermione most things, and she listened with her knees pulled up on the common room sofa and her expression doing the careful, controlled thing it did when she was feeling something strongly and managing it. "What did he say?" she asked. "He said he's sorry," Harry said. "For all of it. The gang, the bullying, all of it. He said he didn't know, when he was little, that it was, he says he thought it was just how it was. That Harry wasn't allowed the same things as Dudley because that was just the way their house worked." He looked at the fire. "And then he says that the police came to interview him, and that he told them the truth." Hermione was very still. "He told them about the cupboard," Harry said. "He told them he remembered Harry sleeping there. He told them about the food, the portion differences, the times Harry was sent to bed without eating. He said," Harry stopped for a moment. "He said he told them everything he could remember, because he thought if he didn't he'd be the person who had the chance to do something and didn't." Again. "Dudley said that?" "Yeah." Hermione pressed her lips together. "Good for him," she said. Yeah, Harry said. I thought so too. Ron was at his usual chair, and he had been listening without appearing to listen, which was one of his skills. Are you going to write back? He said. Harry considered it. The letter was in his pocket and he had thought about it for most of the day, on and off, in the way you thought about something you hadn't decided how to feel about yet. The thing about Dudley was that he wasn't simple, he never had been, underneath the surface brutality of him. There had always been something in there that was just a kid who had been raised by Vernon and Petunia and had absorbed everything they modeled and had never had reason to question any of it until the Dementors, until the graveyard news, until a police officer sat across a table from him and asked him to remember what he'd seen. Yeah, Harry said. I think I will. Marsh called him on the third Thursday in November. He took the call on a Muggle payphone in Hogsmeade. They'd set this up at the Holborn interview. The logistics of reaching him, and the payphone at the bottom of the village's Muggle high street was the solution Hermione had engineered, and stood in the glass booth with his coat collar up against the rain and heard Marsh's voice in the receiver. The CPS have reviewed the file, she said. The documentation, the physical examination, the witness statement. A pause. They're recommending charges. Harry gripped the receiver. Both of them, he said. Your uncle will face charges of actual bodily harm and child cruelty under the Children and Young Persons Act. 3 counts, corresponding to the documented fractures. The CPS is also looking at the Section 1 child cruelty charge, which covers the broader pattern of neglect. Another pause, and her voice shifted slightly, just slightly, to something more careful. Your aunt is more complicated. Her direct participation in physical harm is harder to prove, but the knowing neglect, the documented environment, the cupboard, the dietary restriction, that's enough for a Section 1 charge. Okay, Harry said. Harry. She waited a beat. This is going to trial. The rain came down on the glass of the phone box. He watched it run in streams down the panels, blurring the Hogsmeade street into a watercolor of itself. I know, he said. It means testifying. In court, in front of them. I know. Are you? I'm ready, he said. And he was, in the way that you were ready for something that you had been walking toward since you were 1 year old and left on a doorstep in the dark, not eager, not unafraid, but ready. Prepared. Determined in the particular and unshakable way of someone who had decided that their life was worth defending and was now simply following that decision wherever it went. Good, Marsh said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite professional warmth but was not entirely not that either. We'll talk about next steps. There's a victim support coordinator I want to put you in touch with, and a barrister from our team who'll need to meet with you before the trial date is set. Right. Oh, and Harry. A pause. Off the record, the Dursleys solicitor has already been in contact with our office trying to get the school records excluded as evidence on the grounds of institutional credibility. She let that sit for a moment. The magistrate looked at the records, looked at the physical examination results, and told the defense solicitor that in 30 years on the bench he had never seen more thorough documentation of a safeguarding concern. They're staying in. Harry let out a breath that he'd been holding for about 3 weeks. Good, he said. It is, she agreed. I'll be in touch. The line went quiet. Harry stood in the phone box for another minute, watching the Hogsmeade rain, with the receiver warm in his hand and the static of the ended call still buzzing softly, like something alive. Then he pushed the door open and walked back out into the wet November afternoon, and he could see Hermione and Ron waiting for him at the corner with their hoods up, 2 familiar shapes in the grey drizzle, and he walked toward them with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders straight. Well? Hermione said. They're charging both of them, Harry said. It's going to trial. Hermione made a sound that was definitely a sob this time and immediately composed her face into something more dignified, which he pretended not to notice. Ron grabbed his shoulder and shook it once, hard, the way he had on the Quidditch pitch after victories, wordless and total. The 3 of them stood at the corner in the rain for a moment. Then Hermione pulled out her umbrella, which was enormous and Muggle and could fit all three of them underneath it, and they walked back toward the castle together. "You should eat something," Hermione said, after they'd walked in silence for a while. "You didn't eat at lunch." "I ate at lunch." "You ate half a sandwich and stared at it." "That counts." "It absolutely doesn't count, Harry." "She's right," Ron said. "Elf made stew tonight, I heard Neville say." "You heard Neville say that?" "Neville is a reliable source on dinner." Ron said this with complete conviction. One of his best qualities. Harry laughed. It came out a little abruptly, a little more real than he'd expected, and Hermione looked sideways at him from under the umbrella with an expression that was very carefully not making anything of it. "Stew it is then," Harry said. They walked back to the castle in the rain, all three of them under one umbrella, and the charges existed now in a police office in Surrey, filed and logged and real, and Harry kept walking toward the warm lights of Hogwarts and felt the ground solid under his feet, and thought that it was a good feeling. Sturdier than most feelings he'd had lately. Something had been set in motion that none of them could stop now, including him. He found he didn't want to. Chapter 4, Fault Lines. The charges broke in the wizarding press on a Monday. Not the Prophet this time. The Prophet had been running its campaign of strategic misrepresentation for weeks and had largely exhausted its angles. This was the Quibbler, of all things, which had somehow obtained a leaked copy of the CPS charging document and published it in full, alongside a 5-page feature that Luna Lovegood's father had written with the meticulous, slightly unhinged accuracy that was his particular gift. He had the dates right. He had the charges right. He had the names right. He had included, in a sidebar, a timeline of Madame Pomfrey's unanswered memos to Dumbledore, which he had sourced from somewhere Harry didn't ask about and probably couldn't have explained. The headline was, "The Boy Who Lived in a Cupboard." Harry found out about it the way he found out about most things that week, from Hermione, who appeared at breakfast with the Quibbler under one arm and the Prophet under the other and the expression of someone managing a significant amount of incoming information. She sat down, spread both papers flat, and looked at Harry with the focused calm of a general who had anticipated an engagement and was ready for it. "It's out," she said. "I see that." The Prophet's response is predictable. She slid the Prophet across. Its headline was Potter's Reckless Crusade Endangers Statute in the font they reserved for catastrophes. "But the Quibbler, that's actually accurate," Harry said, reading it. "Yes. Mr. Lovegood has been more careful with facts than I would have expected." She paused. "Luna sent it to him." Harry looked up. Hermione shrugged, which was her version of "I know, I was surprised too." She heard us talking last month and apparently decided independently that it was a story worth telling properly. "I found out last night." "I hope it's fine," Harry said. He looked at the headline again. "The Boy Who Lived in a Cupboard." It was blunt in the way only the Quibbler could be blunt, not vicious, not sensationalist, just plainly, uncomplicatedly accurate. "It's actually fine." Across the table, Neville was reading his own copy with the slow, careful attention he gave to things that mattered. Dean was reading over his shoulder. Neither of them said anything, which Harry appreciated more than if they had. The hall was doing its usual morning thing, plates filling, Owl's Landing, the accumulated noise of 400 people starting their day. But there was a quality to the noise that was different, a particular frequency of murmuring that meant people were talking about the same thing from different corners of the room. Harry could feel it without looking up. "There's going to be a governor's meeting," Hermione said, more quietly. "I heard Professor Sprout mention it to Professor Flitwick this morning." "About Dumbledore." "About his role in it," Harry said. "About his documented knowledge and inaction, yes." Ron poured himself pumpkin juice and said nothing, which meant he was thinking. When he finished thinking, he said, "Is Dumbledore in actual trouble? Like, serious trouble?" "That depends on the governors," Hermione said. "And on what Dumbledore says to them." "He'll be honest," Harry said. They both looked at him. He told me the truth when I asked him, Harry said. He could have talked his way around it and he didn't. Whatever he says to the governors, it'll be the same. He reached for the marmalade. Whether they like it or not is their problem. Dumbledore's meeting with the Board of Governors happened on a Wednesday, in a large conference room on the 4th floor that was normally used for inter-house diplomatic proceedings, a room that managed to feel simultaneously very official and very uncomfortable, which was probably intentional. Harry knew the meeting was happening because McGonagall told him, in the brisk, informational way she'd adopted with him since the whole thing began, as though she had decided he deserved to be treated as someone with a stake in institutional proceedings rather than a child being managed around them. He didn't attend. He had Transfiguration. He sat in Transfiguration and turned a teacup into a tortoise with more precision than usual, which McGonagall graded an O and noted in her record book with a small nod that he thought might mean something. He found out how the governor's meeting went from Dumbledore himself, who asked Harry to come to his office that evening. The office felt different at night, Harry thought. The portraits were awake and attentive in a way they weren't during the day, the previous headmasters watching from their frames with the accumulated weight of institutional memory, each of them having navigated their own versions of this kind of reckoning. Phineas Nigellus looked like he was actively enjoying himself, which was probably not a good sign. Dumbledore was at his desk but not behind it, he'd moved his chair to the side, which Harry had never seen before. The desk wasn't between them. It felt like a deliberate thing. The governors have issued a formal censure, Dumbledore said. He said it the way you stated facts that were already true and couldn't be changed. My conduct with respect to the documented safeguarding concerns is the subject of an official inquiry. I will cooperate fully. Harry sat down. Will you lose your position? That is possible. I consider it unlikely, but it is possible. He looked at Harry steadily. I want you to know that I don't consider that an injustice. If the conclusion of the inquiry is that I failed in my responsibility to a child in this school's care, which is, of course, the correct conclusion, then the consequences that follow from that are appropriate. Harry didn't say anything for a moment. He wasn't sure what he'd expected from this conversation, but this wasn't it. Something straightforward, without the usual layers. Does that bother you? He said. Potentially losing this? Dumbledore was quiet for a moment, and the quietness was genuine, not a considered pause but an actual one, a man thinking about his answer rather than shaping it. I have been headmaster here for a very long time, he said. I have come to believe, I think wrongly, that certain things required my continued presence enough to justify compromises that shouldn't have been made. That is a pernicious trap for anyone in a position of authority. You begin to believe that your role matters more than your conduct in it. The fire crackled. Fawkes shifted on his perch. The inquiry will take time, Dumbledore continued. In the meantime, and regardless of its outcome, I have been in contact with Molly and Arthur Weasley about a formal change in your guardianship arrangement. With the legal proceedings ongoing, your placement with the Dursleys is obviously untenable, and the Ministry has agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to facilitate a temporary guardianship transfer to the Weasley family. He paused. Temporarily. Until the blood protection issue is sorted, Harry said. Until a permanent arrangement can be established that serves both your safety and your happiness. Which should have been considered equally with your safety from the beginning. He said it directly and without embellishment. Can that actually be arranged? Harry said. The Weasleys taking me on formally? Arthur has already submitted the application. Molly, the corner of Dumbledore's mouth moved. Molly submitted it before Arthur mentioned it to me, which tells you everything you need to know about that particular family. Harry felt something unclench in his chest that had been clenched for so long he'd stopped feeling it as tension. He'd just called it normal. Okay, he said. Okay. Good. Yes, Dumbledore said. It is. Petunia Dursley made her move on a Thursday afternoon. Harry found out about it from Marsh, who called the Hogsmeade payphone at 3 o'clock on the dot. Harry had been waiting at it since 2:45, because Marsh's calls were always exactly when she said they'd be, with a voice that was carefully neutral in the way voices went carefully neutral when the news was strange. "I need to tell you something that's happened," she said. "I want you to hear it from me before you hear it from anyone else." Harry felt the specific alertness that came with those words. "Go on." "Your aunt contacted us this morning. Not through her solicitor, directly, which is itself irregular. She asked for a meeting and she came in this afternoon." A pause. "She told us that she has information about you. About your background. About the school you attend and what she described as," another pause, more careful this time. "The magical world." Harry gripped the receiver. "She told us," Marsh continued, "that the school where you were enrolled is not a conventional boarding school. That you were sent there because you are, her word, a wizard. That the documentation we received references incidents that were caused not by human violence but by what she called, and I'm quoting, abnormal occurrences related to his abnormality." The rain on the glass of the phone box. Harry watched it and breathed. "She was trying to discredit the records," he said. "Yes. She was also, I think, trying to shift blame, suggesting that your injuries were self-caused or magically caused rather than inflicted, and that the household was a difficult one to manage because of your—" Marsh stopped. "I want to ask you something directly, Harry, and I want you to tell me the truth." "All right. Is there anything about your background or your school that you think I need to know? Anything that her account might complicate?" Harry stood in the phone box and thought about it. He thought about the records, Hermione's translation, the strict clinical language, the patterns that spoke for themselves. He thought about the physical examination, the healed fractures, the scar tissue. He thought about Dudley's statement, precise and specific and given voluntarily. He thought about what Petunia had tried to do and whether it would work. "The records are accurate," he said. "The injuries are real. The history of neglect is real. Whatever else I am or wherever I go to school, none of that changes what happened in that house." "No," Marsh said. "It doesn't." And the firmness in her voice meant she'd already decided that before she called. She was confirming rather than seeking reassurance. Her solicitor got in touch with ours within an hour of the meeting to walk back everything she'd said, by the way. I suspect they told her very clearly that trying to introduce the idea of magic into a criminal trial was not going to strengthen her position. "What happened with what she said?" "It was noted and filed," Marsh said. "It will not be part of the prosecution's case. The defense can try to introduce it if they choose, but I've spoken with our barrister, and frankly, if the Dursleys' best defense strategy is to tell a magistrate that the injuries were caused by magic, I will take that trade with pleasure." Harry almost laughed. "Yeah. Fair enough. There's something else," Marsh said. "The attempt to contact us directly, outside her solicitor, it suggests she's panicking. That's usually a sign that someone knows the evidence against them is strong." She paused. "I thought you'd want to know that too." "Thank you," Harry said. "For calling me." "Of course." A brief pause that felt like something more than professional courtesy. "How are you holding up?" "Fine," he said, and then stopped, because Marsh was one of the people to whom he'd gotten out of the habit of saying fine and meaning nothing by it. "It's a lot," he said. "Most days I'm okay and occasionally I'm not, and then I'm okay again." "That's about right," Marsh said. "That's exactly what it's supposed to feel like." The governor's inquiry ran its early sessions in the first week of December, which meant the castle had a quality of suppressed anticipation overlaid on the usual pre-Christmas energy that Harry found genuinely difficult to parse. On any given day you might pass a group of students debating the Quibbler's latest update in the corridor, run into Umbridge in the worst possible place at the worst possible time, and also have to think about what you wanted for Christmas, and these three things did not naturally coexist. Hermione had taken it upon herself, because she had taken everything upon herself to some degree, which was her nature, and Harry had long since decided it was better to let her than to pretend he didn't need her, to monitor the governor's proceedings through a contact she had developed in the form of a fifth-year Ravenclaw whose mother was on the board. The contact's name was Philip and he was primarily motivated by a crush on Hermione that was so transparent even Ron had noticed it, but he was also genuinely useful. The main thing, Hermione reported one evening, with Philip's latest note folded in her hand and the fire painting her in amber, is that 3 governors have called for Dumbledore's suspension pending the inquiry's conclusion. 3 others are firmly against. The rest are waiting to see how the trial goes. The trial affects his position, Ron said. Everything affects everything at this point, Hermione said, in the tone of someone who found this both obvious and exhausting. If the trial produces a conviction, it validates the documentation, which validates the criticism of Dumbledore's response to the documentation. If the defense succeeds in muddying the record somehow, they won't, Harry said. No, she agreed. But the governors don't know that yet. Umbridge will use it, Ron said. Whatever's happening with the inquiry, she'll try to use it. He was right. Umbridge had been quieter since the conversation in the Charms corridor, which Harry had initially interpreted as backing off but had gradually come to understand was actually the quietness of someone repositioning. She was on the Hogwarts board as the ministry's official observer, which gave her standing in the inquiry proceedings, and she was using it with the patient, calculated efficiency of someone who had been waiting for a lever and had found a very good one. The lever wasn't Harry. It was Dumbledore. Umbridge had no affection for Dumbledore and never had. The inquiry gave her a legitimate mechanism to apply pressure, and she was applying it with enthusiasm, filing formal observations about standards of institutional care and the responsibility of leadership and the ministry's serious concerns regarding the oversight culture at Hogwarts. Every one of these observations was technically valid. Every one of them was also transparently self-serving. The effect was to make the inquiry about Dumbledore's fitness to lead rather than about the specific failure regarding Harry, which was a subtle but significant redirection. McGonagall identified this before most people did, and Harry knew she'd identified it because she mentioned it to him directly one afternoon after Transfiguration when the other students had filed out. "Sit down a moment, Potter." He sat. She stood at her desk, not behind it, in her habitual way when she was talking to him as a person rather than as a student. "You should be aware," she said, "that there is a political dimension to the inquiry that goes beyond your case. Dolores Umbridge is using the proceedings to pursue an agenda that predates all of this by several years. I want you to know that because I don't want you to be surprised by it, and because I want to be clear." She paused, and the pause was weighted. "None of that is your responsibility. You pursued justice through legitimate means. Whatever political fallout occurs in this institution as a result of that is not a consequence you need to feel guilty about." Harry looked at her. "I don't feel guilty." "Good. I do feel," he stopped. "Tired, sometimes. Not about the case. Just about all the things that are happening around it that aren't the case." McGonagall was quiet for a moment. She sat down behind her desk, and her expression had something in it that was more unguarded than usual. "Yes," she said. "I imagine that's accurate." She looked at him. "I want to say something to you, Potter, that I should have said a long time ago and didn't. I was aware, not to the degree that I should have been, but aware, that your situation at the Dursleys was not ideal. I deferred to Dumbledore's judgment, and I used the word ideal where I should have used words that were more accurate. I'm sorry for that." He looked at her for a long moment. She met his eyes without flinching, which was very McGonagall. "Thank you," he said. "Professor." She nodded once, crisply, and picked up a quill. "Your Transfiguration essay is due Friday," she said. "Don't be late with it." "Right," he said, and stood up. "Potter." He paused at the door. "Your mother was one of the finest students I ever taught. I believe she would find this," a pause in which she selected the word carefully. "Correct." He walked out into the corridor and stood for a moment in the stone-smelling quiet, and felt it, not grief exactly, more like the specific ache of a kindness that arrived late and was still a kindness. The trial date was set for the 4th of February. Marsh called him with it on the last Saturday before Christmas break, and Harry wrote it on a piece of parchment and put it next to his bed where he could see it from the pillow, not because he needed a reminder, but because having it written down in a specific, real way made it more solid. It was a real date on a real calendar. It existed. The Weasley family had been, the only word was tremendous. Molly had written Harry 3 letters in the past month, each one more practical than the last, listing arrangements and plans and once, memorably, including a hand-drawn floor plan of the Burrow with your room written in small letters next to the second bedroom on the upper floor. The formality of that had hit him somewhere unexpected. Your room. Not the spare room, not where Harry sleeps. His room. Arthur had navigated the guardianship paperwork with methodical enthusiasm, treating the Muggle legal system with the same delighted curiosity he applied to electricity plugs and rubber ducks, and had apparently become something of a favorite of the Surrey Children's Services family court coordinator, who had described him in a note to Marsh as unusually well informed about statutory care proceedings for a parent of his generation. He read the entire Children Act, Hermione said when Harry told her this, with the expression of someone encountering a kindred spirit. The whole thing? Ron said. Apparently yes. That's so, that's such a dad thing. Ron looked briefly overwhelmed, in the way he occasionally looked when something made clear how much he loved his family and he hadn't been prepared for the feeling. Okay. Good. The last day of term was a Thursday. The castle came down with Christmas in the way it always did, spectacular and sudden, as though Hogwarts itself had decided overnight to commit fully to the season. Garlands, candles, the tree in the great hall that required a stepladder to decorate even with magic. Third year's carols in the entrance hall that grew progressively more chaotic as the evening went on. Snow on the grounds, proper thick snow that Peeves was already using as ammunition. Harry walked the corridors that evening after dinner, alone, not anxiously but just moving. He did this sometimes, needed to be in the building by himself, in the old stone quiet of it, without the weight of people and their concern. He liked Hogwarts best in the in-between hours, when the noise had settled and the torches were burning low and the portraits were dozing in their frames and the castle was just itself. He went up to the astronomy tower, not for any particular reason, just because it was high and open and the view was the view. He pushed the door open into the cold and stood at the parapet and looked out over the grounds. The lake was dark and still. The forbidden forest was a black mass at the edge of everything. The sky above the highlands was full of stars, the kind of sky you could only see properly from somewhere this far from a city, all depth and distance. He thought about the 4th of February. He thought about standing in a Muggle courtroom in front of Vernon Dursley and saying out loud, on the record, in front of a magistrate and a barrister and a gallery of strangers, everything he had already said once in the quiet room in Holborn. He thought about whether he was ready for it, and his honest answer was, yes. Not without nerves. Not without difficulty. But yes. He had been a lot of things in his life. He'd been afraid and reckless and sometimes both at once. He'd been the boy who lived, a title that came with expectations he'd never asked for. He'd been a Quidditch player and a Triwizard champion and the only person to survive a killing curse, which was a thing he'd been for as long as he could remember without it ever quite feeling real. But this was the most concrete thing he had ever done. Not magical. Not legendary. Not tied to a prophecy or a destiny or anyone else's war. He had found a file, and he had decided it mattered, and he had sent a letter, and because of that letter 2 people who had hurt him for 10 years were going to stand in front of a court and be asked to account for it. That had all come from him. No phoenix feather, no invisibility cloak, no help from the dead. Just Harry Potter, age 15, who had decided he was worth fighting for. He stayed at the top of the tower for a long time, until the cold was genuinely uncomfortable and his fingers were going numb inside his gloves. Then he went back down. Ron was in the common room when he got back, playing chess against himself with the aggressive focus of someone who had run out of opponents. "Where were you?" Ron said. "Astronomy tower. It's freezing." "I know." Ron studied the board. "You know what I've been thinking about?" "What?" When we come back from break. You've got all the legal stuff, and the trial prep, and whatever happens with the governors. He moved a knight. We should also probably deal with the fact that Voldemort is building an army and Umbridge is ruining the education of everyone in this school. Yeah, Harry said, sitting down. I've been thinking about that too. DA, Ron said. DA, Harry agreed. Ron looked up from the board. We're going to do all of it, he said. Not as a question. As a statement of fact from someone who had made his mind up. Yeah, Harry said. We are. Ron nodded and moved his queen. Right then. Help me beat myself, I'm losing badly and it's embarrassing. Harry laughed and pulled his chair up to the board, and outside the common room tower windows the snow came down clean and thick over the Hogwarts grounds, and the new year was 2 weeks away, and the 4th of February was in it, and Harry was ready. The letter from the Dursleys solicitor arrived on the 28th of December, routed through Marsh, who forwarded it with a brief note that said, "See attached. Standard pre-trial motion. Don't worry about it." The motion was a formal attempt to have the school records excluded from evidence on the grounds that Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry was not a registered educational institution under UK law and that its medical staff had no recognized professional standing. It cited 3 cases and 4 statutes. Hermione, who was at the Burrow for Christmas and received the forwarded copy from Harry over the Weasley kitchen table, read it in 4 minutes and then set it down and said, "The physical examination is entirely independent of the school records. Even if they successfully exclude Madame Pomfrey's file, which they won't, but even if they did, the GP examination results, Dudley's statement, and Harry's own testimony are sufficient for conviction on the majority of counts." Arthur, who had been listening from behind his newspaper, lowered it slightly. "The records will stay in," he said with quiet confidence. Private school medical records have been admitted in care proceedings in the absence of official registry before. 1997, Surrey County Court, Re L. The precedent exists. Everyone looked at him. "I read the Children Act," he said mildly, and went back to his paper. Molly put a plate of mince pies on the table with a decisive clatter that meant she had an opinion. "They're trying to frighten you," she said to Harry. Solicitors' letters before a trial are almost always about frightening the other side into withdrawing. "You're not withdrawing." "No," Harry said. "Good," she said, and the word landed with all the comfortable certainty of a woman who had raised 7 children and faced down considerably more frightening things than Muggle pre-trial motions. "Eat a mince pie." Harry ate a mince pie. It was, as Molly's baking always was, exceptional, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the Burrow's uneven windows the December countryside was white and still. Ginny was arguing with Ron about something involving gnomes. Fred and George were in the living room making noises that suggested they were field testing something inadvisable. The wireless in the corner was playing something cheerful. Harry sat in the middle of it and felt, with a clarity that surprised him, something that he didn't always feel in this house but felt properly now, that he was in the right place. The motion would fail. The trial would proceed. The 4th of February was 6 weeks away. He finished his mince pie and reached for another, and Molly, without looking up from the stove, said, "Take 2, you're still too thin," and Ron snorted, and Harry took 2. The motion was denied on the 5th of January. The physical examination report, the magistrate noted in his ruling, stood entirely independent of the disputed institutional records. In any event, the private medical records of a boarding school, while unusual in format, were not unprecedented as evidence in care proceedings. The objection was overruled. Marsh called Harry from the payphone as arranged. She read him the relevant section of the ruling in full. "We're on," she said. "We're on," Harry said. He hung up and walked back to the castle with the January wind at his back and the trial 6 weeks away and something building in his chest that wasn't quite nerves and wasn't quite excitement but was made of both of them and of something harder and more certain underneath. The case was real. The date was real. The Dursleys were going to stand in a courtroom. And Harry was going to be there when they did. Chapter 5. The weight of knowing the courtroom was smaller than Harry had imagined. He'd built it up in his mind over 6 weeks into something vast and echoing, high-ceilinged and formal, the kind of room where the architecture itself passed judgment. What he got was a magistrate's court in Guildford that smelled of carpet cleaner and old radiators, with strip lighting that gave everyone a slightly greenish cast and chairs that had been practical once and weren't anymore. The public gallery was 8 rows of padded seats, half full by the time Harry arrived. The magistrate's bench was raised but not dramatically. The whole thing was, in the best possible way, completely ordinary. Marsh met him outside the building at 8:30, with the barrister assigned to the prosecution, a compact, precise woman named Judith Okafor who had a handshake like a vice and an accent that moved between received pronunciation and something warmer depending on whether she was addressing the court or addressing Harry. She'd met with him twice before this morning, in a room at the CPS offices with a whiteboard and a lot of preparation, and she had the quality Harry most needed in a person today. She made things clear. "How are you doing?" Marsh asked. "Fine," Harry said, and then, because it was Marsh, nervous. "But okay." "Good." She handed him a coffee, which was from a paper cup and was not excellent, but was hot. "That's the right way to be." Okafor was already reviewing something on a sheaf of papers with the focused energy of someone who had been up since 5. "The defense will try 2 things today," she said, as if continuing a conversation she'd been having in her head. "First, they'll challenge the weight of the medical evidence, not its admissibility, that's settled, but its interpretation. They'll bring a medical witness to suggest the fracture pattern is consistent with a child who was simply physically active and accident-prone." She looked up. "They'll also try to characterize Harry as a troubled young person with a history of behavioral difficulties who has constructed a narrative." "I know," Harry said. "When that happens, and it will happen, you don't react. You just answer the questions as asked. Direct, factual, no elaboration beyond what's needed." She looked at him. "You've already said everything that needs to be said in your witness statement. Today is just saying it again in front of different people." "Right. The magistrate has read the CPS file. He's read the physical examination. He's read Dudley Desley's statement." She closed her folder. "Our job today is to make sure none of that gets obscured." Harry nodded. He drank the coffee. Inside the building, through the glass doors, he could see people beginning to move through security, and somewhere in that movement, he knew, were Vernon and Petunia Desley, arriving for the same day he was arriving for, through different entrances, into the same small ordinary room. He thought about the cupboard. The specific dimensions of it. The hot water pipe. Then he stopped thinking about it, and walked through the doors. Vernon Desley was heavier than Harry remembered, or perhaps it was the suit, dark gray, clearly new, bought for this occasion in a way that was somehow visible in how it sat on him. He was across the room when Harry first saw him, talking to a solicitor in the focused undertone of someone receiving last-minute instructions. His face was a particular shade of red that Harry recognized from childhood as his furious color, though it was being rigidly controlled this morning into something that was meant to project dignity. Petunia was next to him, very straight, a navy coat Harry had never seen before, her hair more fixed than usual. She looked, Harry thought, exactly as she always looked, contained, precise, the appearance of a woman who kept things. She was holding her handbag in both hands. Neither of them looked at Harry immediately. When Vernon's eyes did find him, it was brief, a flicker, then away. But in that flicker something happened in Vernon's face that Harry noted with a flat, clear interest. Not defiance. Not contempt. Something that looked much more like a man who had seen the shape of what was coming and understood it. Petunia looked at him for longer. Her eyes moved over him in the deliberate way of someone taking inventory. Then she looked away too. Harry found his seat behind Okafor and Carol from Children's Services and sat down. In the public gallery he could see, without turning his head, that Ron and Hermione were there. They'd argued about it. Hermione had argued that she should be present, Ron had argued the same thing with less structure but equal conviction, and Harry had said yes because he was done pretending he didn't need people. Arthur Weasley was there too, in Muggle clothes he'd clearly gotten advice on from Hermione, sitting with his hands on his knees with the expression of a man who was here in every sense of the word. Luna Lovegood was there, which Harry hadn't expected, in the third row in a pale yellow coat, looking entirely serene in a room full of institutional anxiety. She'd sent him a note through school post that said, "I thought I'd come. I hope that's all right. I've been to 3 Muggle trials with my father for research purposes and find them rather interesting." Harry had found this deeply comforting for reasons he couldn't fully explain. Neville was not there, he'd wanted to be, but Harry had talked him out of it on the basis that someone needed to stay at Hogwarts and cover for their extended absence from classes in a way that didn't require Umbridge's involvement. Neville had accepted this with the quiet reliability that made him, Harry thought, one of the best people he knew. The magistrate came in. Everyone stood, then sat. It began. Okafor's opening statement was 8 minutes long and stripped to bone. She stated the charges. She stated what the evidence would show. She said the word pattern 11 times, Harry counted, not because he was nervous but because counting gave him something to do with his attention while he waited. Pattern of injury. Pattern of neglect. Pattern of documentation met with inaction. Pattern of a child whose physical condition deteriorated every time he returned to the defendant's home. She did not describe it dramatically. She didn't need to. The facts were dramatic in themselves, in the flat clinical way that the most terrible things were always most terrible when stated plainly. The defense opening was delivered by a QC named Hartley who had silver hair and an air of expensive competence, and who spent 12 minutes suggesting that what the prosecution would present as deliberate harm was in fact the documented frustrations of a family who had been placed in an extraordinary and impossible situation, a child with difficulties, a household under strain, a school whose records were, at best, idiosyncratic. He said the word context 7 times. Harry watched the magistrate during this. The magistrate was 60s, silver-haired too but in a different way, with reading glasses that he looked over when he was paying attention and through when he was writing. He wrote during Hartley's opening. Harry noted that. Okafor called Madame Pomfrey first, which had required some extraordinary logistical management involving Dumbledore, a letter to the court asserting that the witness was the resident healer of a private educational institution in Scotland, and the complete suppression of the word magic in all relevant documentation. Poppy Pomfrey walked into a Muggle courtroom in a Muggle suit she'd clearly purchased and worn twice, her hair in its usual severe arrangement, her back arrow straight, and looked around the room with the expression of someone who had dealt with considerably more dramatic situations in her professional life and was choosing to treat this as routine. She took the oath and sat down. Okafor walked her through the records with methodical care, each entry, each date, each clinical notation. Pomfrey answered in the precise, clipped language of medical evidence, the language of a professional who had documented everything because documentation was how you proved things happened, and who had spent 25 years hoping someone would eventually use that documentation for exactly this purpose. When Okafor reached the first flag, November 1991, reported to senior institutional staff, no action recorded, the courtroom went very still. And when you say no action was recorded, Okafor said, can you confirm that you made this report? Yes, Pomfrey said. And you received no response? I received an acknowledgement. No substantive response. You flagged the concern again in 1992, 1993, 1994, and twice in 1995, Pomfrey said. Yes. The pace and flatness of it was damning in a way that no dramatic delivery could have matched. And across all of those 7 reports, no action was taken, Pomfrey said. Hartley's cross-examination was skilled. He established that Pomfrey had never personally witnessed any incident of harm at the Dursley home. He established that some of the injuries could theoretically be consistent with sporting activity. He established that weight deficiencies in boarding school-age children could have multiple causes. Pomfrey conceded each technically accurate point with the measured calm of someone who knew that tactical concessions in cross-examination didn't change the overall shape of what she'd said. When Hartley sat down, Pomfrey looked at the magistrate. "May I add a note of clarification?" The magistrate looked over his glasses. "You may. The question is not whether any individual injury has an innocent explanation," she said. "It is whether the pattern, taken as a whole, across 4 years, is consistent with accidental harm. In my professional opinion of 37 years, it is not." Hartley did not re-examine. The GP who had conducted Harry's physical examination was called next, Dr. Sarah O'Say, who presented her findings in the careful, precise language of a doctor who knew exactly how to give evidence, which meant every word was weighted and nothing was wasted. She confirmed the healed fractures. She confirmed the scar tissue, located and described without drama. She confirmed the residual markers of childhood nutritional deficiency. She said, "The pattern is consistent with sustained physical harm and chronic nutritional neglect over an extended period. In my clinical assessment, these findings corroborate the documented medical history." Hartley cross-examined for 20 minutes. He got nothing. Dudley's statement was read into the record rather than delivered in person. Harry had known this was coming, had known Dudley wouldn't be in the room, and understood why. The family court coordinator had explained that given Dudley's position as the defendant's son, his live testimony would place him in an untenable position between competing obligations. His written statement, given voluntarily, was sufficient. Okafor read it in full. Harry had read the statement before, in Marsh's office, 3 weeks ago. He read it again now through hearing it spoken aloud in a courtroom, with his aunt and uncle 5 meters away and the recorder running and the magistrate writing. Dudley's statement was not elegant. It was not artfully constructed. It was a 17-year-old boy describing what he had seen in the manner of someone who had sat down and tried very hard to tell the truth completely, in order, without omission. He described the cupboard. He described the meals, his portions and Harry's, side by side, and how he'd always known there was a difference and had been taught, without anyone quite saying it, that the difference was correct. He described Privet Drive in summer, what it sounded like, what his father's temper sounded like. He described specific incidents with the flat, remembered precision of someone who had been trying not to remember them for years. He wrote, "I want to say I didn't know it was wrong. But I think I did know, in the way that you know something you've decided not to look at directly. I looked away for a long time. I'm not looking away anymore." The courtroom was quiet when Okafor stopped reading. Vernon Dursley was very still. Harry glanced at him once. The red had gone out of Vernon's face. What was left was something smaller and less certain, the face of a man watching the thing he'd built very carefully for 30 years being taken apart by a statement from his own son. Petunia was looking at the table in front of her. Harry took the stand at 2:15 in the afternoon, after the lunch recess, which he had spent in a small room off the corridor with Marsh and a sandwich he'd managed about half of. "You ready?" Marsh said. "Yes. Remember, direct, factual, no elaboration beyond what's asked." He'd said it back to her 4 times in preparation. "I know. And if Hartley tries to rattle you," she said, "let him try. You don't have to be rattled." Harry looked at her. "I've been rattled by significantly worse than a defense barrister," he said. Marsh looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "I know you have." He walked out and took the stand. The room looked different from the witness box, lower ceiling somehow, closer walls, the gallery more visible. He could see Ron with his arms folded and his jaw set. He could see Hermione with her hands very still on her lap, the position she used for controlling herself. Arthur had his hands on his knees, watching Harry with an expression that was steady and warm and present, the expression of a man who had decided to be there and was fully there. Luna had her head tilted slightly, as though the courtroom were a particularly interesting natural phenomenon she was observing. He looked at Okafor and waited. She took him through it in a clear, logical progression, his living arrangements from earliest memory through to Hogwarts, the incidents the records documented, the summers. She asked questions that opened space for him to speak without pushing him into more than was needed. He answered them in the order asked, in his own voice, without performance. He'd told this story before, in Holborn, in Carol's notes, in Marsh's formal interview, in the solicitor's office. He knew its shape. He walked through it steadily, and the recorder took it all down, and the magistrate wrote, and Harry kept going. When Okafor sat down, Hartley stood. He was good. Harry had expected him to be good and he was. He established quickly that Harry had a contentious relationship with his uncle. Contentious was the word he used, which Harry noted was doing a great deal of work. He asked whether Harry had ever been disciplined at school. Harry said yes, a few times, and Hartley nodded as though that meant something, which it didn't. He asked about Harry's parents, about his early life, about whether Harry had ever been told that his arrival had placed the Dursley household under significant pressure. They mentioned it, yes, Harry said. Regularly? Yes. And in the context of those mentions, would you say you were aware that they considered your presence a difficulty? I was aware they considered me a problem, Harry said. From very early on. Hartley paused slightly at the phrasing, which was not quite the same as his question. And is it possible that a child who felt unwanted might? I didn't feel unwanted, Harry said. I was unwanted. Those are different things. Feeling unwanted can be a child's misinterpretation of a situation. Being unwanted is something that adults did to me consistently and on purpose. The records document the results of that. The courtroom was very quiet. Hartley adjusted. You spent most of your year at boarding school. Away from the household. Yes. The alleged incidents the prosecution has described, not alleged, Harry said. I'm sorry. You said alleged. The physical examination by Dr. Osei confirmed the injuries. They're not alleged. A pause. Hartley looked at him for a moment, not threatened, but recalibrating. Harry looked back. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't performing anything. He was just precise, in the way that Marsh had taught him to be precise, in the way that Hermione had modeled for him for 5 years. The incidents that are subject to this proceeding, Hartley said, revised. Yes. I spent most of the year away. I came back every summer. And during those school terms, you were healthy and well cared for. I improved during school terms, Harry said. Which is what Madame Pomfrey documented. It's also documented that I deteriorated each time I returned to Privet Drive. He paused. That's in the records. Hartley tried 2 more angles. Harry answered both cleanly and without elaboration. The second one was an attempt to suggest that Harry had been difficult to manage, high-spirited, was the term Hartley used, to which Harry said, a child who isn't being fed adequately and is sleeping in a cupboard and is frightened regularly is going to present as difficult to manage. That's usually a symptom, not a cause. Okafor didn't object. She didn't need to. Hartley sat down. Harry stepped down from the witness box and walked back to his seat, and he felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, the difference between the weight he'd been carrying into that box and what he was carrying coming out of it. Not lighter exactly, it was all still there, the whole 10 years of it. But it had been said. In a room with a record. In front of people whose job was to hear it. It existed now in a different dimension, not just in his body, not just in Pomfrey's file, but in the official account of things that had happened. He sat down. Okafor touched his arm briefly, once, and went back to her papers. Vernon took the stand in the afternoon session and did what Harry had expected him to do, which was to be convincing to no one. He was not a stupid man. He had clearly been very thoroughly prepared by Hartley, and his account was internally consistent in the way of accounts that have been practiced. He was a respectable man, a professional man, a homeowner, a taxpayer. He had taken in his wife's orphan nephew out of duty. The boy had been difficult. The injuries were accidents. The weight, well, the boy was a picky eater, always had been, you couldn't force a child to eat. The room under the stairs had been temporary, years ago, a very brief arrangement until the spare room was available. Okafor cross-examined with the focused efficiency of a surgeon. She asked him to confirm the dates the box room had become available. He confirmed them. She asked whether the room had been accessible before that date. A pause. He said yes. She asked why, then, Harry had slept under the stairs until he was nearly 11 rather than in an accessible room. The pause this time lasted 5 seconds. He was used to it, Vernon said. He was used to sleeping in a cupboard, Okafor said, flat. He had adapted to it. It wasn't, did you or did you not install a lock on the outside of the cupboard door? 6 seconds. Yes. Why? 2. Vernon's color was coming back. For security. Whose security? The courtroom was quiet in the way it had been going quiet all day, in increments, the silence getting heavier each time. The household's, Vernon said. You installed a lock on the outside of the door of the room where a child slept, Okafor said, for the security of the household. She paused. No further questions. Hartley did not re-examine. Petunia was last. She walked to the witness stand with the composure that had been her defining characteristic for as long as Harry had known her, the composure of a woman who had decided very early that feelings were a kind of weakness and had built her entire personality as a fortress against them. She sat down, folded her hands, and looked at Okafor with the expression she had always used on Harry when she was about to say something that was technically true and deeply unkind simultaneously. Okafor's questions for Petunia were different in structure than those for Vernon. Quieter, in a way. More personal. Mrs. Dursley, you are aware that this case specifically concerns conduct at your home. Yes. You were present in that home during all of the periods under discussion. Yes. You had primary responsibility for the daily care of your nephew. I cared for him as I cared for my own son. That is not what the evidence suggests, Okafor said, and the gentleness of it was somehow more cutting than aggression would have been. The evidence suggests that your nephew consistently received significantly less food than your son. That he slept in inadequate conditions while your son had a bedroom. That injuries were not addressed, or were explained away, while your nephew explained them himself in terms that medical professionals found inconsistent. A pause. You knew what was happening in your house, Mrs. Dursley. I did my best, Petunia said. Your nephew told our officer that he was aware, from very early in his life, that you considered him a problem. Do you dispute that? Petunia's hands tightened on the railing of the witness box. Children misinterpret, do you dispute that you considered him a problem? The silence stretched out. Harry watched his aunt's face. He had looked at that face 1,000 times and never been able to read it entirely, had spent years trying to understand what was underneath the composed surface of her, and now, in a magistrate's court in Guildford with the strip lights and the old radiators and the smell of carpet cleaner, he watched the composition slip. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was something more complex and less clean. Something that had been buried for a long time under a great deal of effort and had not, despite that effort, gone away. He was difficult, she said. From the beginning. He was different and difficult and I didn't, she stopped. You didn't what? Okafor asked quietly. Petunia looked at the table. I didn't want him, she said. It came out very small. I didn't want any of it. I didn't want the letters and the strangeness and having to explain to people, so you took it out on a child, Okafor said. You took it out on a child who had no one else. Okafor's voice was even and completely unmoved. No further questions. Harry looked at his aunt as she stepped down from the stand, and felt something he hadn't expected to feel, which was not triumph and not satisfaction and not grief exactly either. It was the feeling of finally seeing something clearly, not understanding it, not forgiving it, but seeing it for exactly what it was without any of the protective distortion of childhood around it. She had been a person who had been given a child she didn't want and had treated him accordingly, and had convinced herself that this was normal, and it had never been normal, and she had known that the whole time. He looked at the table in front of him. He breathed. The magistrate's deliberation took 90 minutes. Harry spent them in the small room off the corridor with Marsh and Okafor and Carol and a cup of tea that was better than the morning's coffee. Hermione and Ron and Arthur were allowed in too. No one said very much. Hermione read something. Ron sat with his knee going up and down. Arthur had brought a Muggle newspaper and was reading it with what Harry suspected was more focus than the articles actually required. Marsh sat across from Harry and didn't hover, which he appreciated. She had the particular composure of someone who had been through this many times and had learned that waiting was a skill. "Can you tell how it's going to go?" Ron asked her, at about the 40-minute mark. "No," she said. "But I have opinions." "What are your opinions?" "Optimistic," she said. "For what it's worth." At 92 minutes, the clerk came to the door. The magistrate read his findings in a level, measured voice that matched the room, practical, unsentimental, clear. On the charge of child cruelty under Section 1 of the Children and Young Persons Act 1933, in respect of the sustained pattern of neglect documented across the period, Vernon Dursley, guilty. Petunia Dursley, guilty. On the 3 counts of actual bodily harm corresponding to the documented fractures, Vernon Dursley, guilty on 2 counts, not proven on the 3rd, which the magistrate noted was a consequence of insufficient direct evidence linking Vernon specifically to the 3rd incident rather than any doubt about the injury itself. On the charge of failure to provide adequate living conditions, both defendants, guilty. He spoke for another 4 minutes about the evidence, about the documentary record that he described as among the most thorough he had encountered in proceedings of this type. He noted specifically Dudley Dursley's voluntary statement, and said it had been given evident weight. He said that the pattern documented was not consistent with accidental harm or the ordinary difficulties of child rearing, and that the court took seriously the failure of internal institutional reporting to trigger appropriate external response. He set sentencing for 3 weeks' time, ordered pre-sentence reports, and rose. The room moved and reorganized around Harry, and he sat in the middle of it and led it. Okafor was already talking to Carol. Marsh was on her phone. The defense team were gathering papers with the focused movements of people who had something unpleasant to do and were doing it professionally. The gallery was in motion. Ron's hand landed on Harry's shoulder, heavy and warm and there. Harry sat for a moment longer. He didn't feel what he'd expected to feel, which was some clean version of triumph or release. What he felt was more complicated and less cinematic. He felt the way you felt after a very long journey when you'd finally arrived somewhere, tired, and real, and the destination not quite matching what you'd imagined because destinations never quite matched what you imagined, but still there. Still arrived. Hermione sat down on his other side and didn't say anything. Outside the courtroom, Harry stood on the steps of the building in the February cold and watched Guildford get on with its afternoon. A bus went past. 2 people ate sandwiches on a bench across the road. The sky was white and flat and ordinary. Marsh came out and stood beside him. "How are you feeling?" she said. He thought about it for a long moment. "Like it happened," he said. "Like it's real now." "It was always real," she said. "I know. But now it's official. On the record." He looked at the ordinary street. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," Marsh said. "It makes complete sense." She was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, what you did, from start to finish, takes a kind of courage that most adults I know wouldn't be able to manage. I want you to know that." Harry looked at the bench across the road where the 2 people were eating sandwiches in the February cold and didn't know it was a significant afternoon. "Thank you," he said. "For all of it. For taking it seriously from the beginning." "It was serious from the beginning," she said simply. Arthur came out and stood with them, and after a moment he put a hand on Harry's other shoulder in the same way Ron had inside, different hand, same intention, and the three of them stood in the February cold for a moment while Guilford moved around them. Then Ron appeared on the steps behind them and said, "Right. I don't know about everyone else, but I need to eat something substantial, because it has been a very long day and I have thoughts about a pub meal that I need to act on." And that was the end of the courtroom afternoon. 3 weeks later, Vernon Dursley was sentenced to 18 months imprisonment on the combined charges, with a further 12 months suspended. The judge at sentencing, the case had moved to Crown Court for sentencing given the custodial recommendation, noted the severity of the sustained conduct and specifically referenced the fact that the perpetrators had benefited from the failure of institutional reporting for years, without which the abuse might have ended sooner. Petunia received a suspended sentence of 12 months, conditional on 2 years of supervision and mandatory participation in a child protection program. The judge noted her more limited direct role in the physical harm while making clear that knowing neglect was not a lesser offense. Harry was not in the room for sentencing. He had been given the option and had declined. Marsh called him with the result from the Hogsmeade payphone at 4 in the afternoon, and he listened to it standing in the cold glass box with the Highland wind at the glass, and when she finished reading the sentences he said, "Thank you, Claire." The first time he'd used her name. A beat. "You're welcome, Harry," she said. "Take care of yourself." He hung up and walked back to the castle. The February dusk was coming in fast over the grounds, the sky going that deep Highland blue over the lake, and he walked through it with his hands in his pockets and his footsteps on the frost-hardened path. He went up to Gryffindor Tower. Ron was there, and Hermione, and Ginny and Neville and Luna, who had all somehow been informed or had simply intuited, which in Luna's case was probably the same thing. Someone had produced butterbeers and a plate of sandwiches that had Molly Weasley's construction logic written all over them, which meant they'd been magically sent from the Burrow, which meant Arthur had told Molly the moment the sentence was announced. Harry sat down among them in the firelight and took a sandwich and felt the castle around him, the old stone solidity of it, the warmth, the particular sound it made in the evening when the day was winding down. He felt his friends around him, the specific texture of this group of people who had chosen each other and kept choosing each other even when it was complicated. He thought about a letter he would write to Dudley. He thought about the 4th of February, and what it had felt like to stand in that witness box, and what it had felt like to come down from it. He thought about Marsh's phrase. It was serious from the beginning. Yes. It had been. He had just needed someone who could see that. "You all right?" Ron asked, from the chair next to him. "Yeah," Harry said. "Really?" Harry looked at the fire. "Yeah," he said again. "Actually yeah." Ron nodded and reached for a sandwich. Outside the tower windows, the dark had come down properly over the Hogwarts grounds, and the stars were beginning, far above the mountains, and in a cell somewhere in Surrey, Vernon Dursley was beginning the first evening of 18 months. Harry did not think about that for very long. He thought about the fire instead, and the warmth, and the people in the room with him. He thought about the Burrow and the room that Molly had labeled his room on a hand-drawn floor plan. Then Neville said something that made Ginny laugh, and the laugh was loud and real, and Harry laughed too, and the evening went on. Chapter 6, After spring came to Hogwarts the way it always did, not gradually but in a sudden aggressive declaration, the grounds going from grey to green almost overnight, the lake losing its winter opacity and turning that particular deep blue that made you want to sit beside it and not be anywhere else. The snow came off the mountains in the second week of March and the air smelled of cold water and turned earth and something that wasn't quite warmth yet but was the memory of warmth, which was close enough. Harry noticed it more than usual this year. He wasn't sure why, except that noticing things felt different now, more deliberate, less automatic. Like he'd been looking at the world through glass for a long time and someone had cleaned it. He was sitting by the lake on a Thursday afternoon when Dumbledore found him. He'd known this conversation was coming. It had been approaching for weeks, since the sentencing, since the governor's inquiry had concluded its first phase and produced its findings, since the Daily Prophet had run 3 consecutive front pages that had ranged from grudging acknowledgement to outright apology, which in Prophet terms was a seismic event. It had been coming since February and was now, clearly, here. Dumbledore sat down on the grass beside Harry with the careful movements of a man who was older than he looked and was occasionally reminded of it. He was not in his usual robes, he had on something simpler, darker, which made him seem, in the open afternoon light beside the lake, considerably more human than he did behind his desk. He didn't say anything immediately. Neither did Harry. They sat and watched the lake and a group of second-years doing something inadvisable with a paper boat at the water's edge, and the silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of two people who had things to say and were deciding how to start. "The governors have concluded their inquiry," Dumbledore said at last. "I know," Harry said. "McGonagall told me." "Then you know the formal censure stands. I have been issued a written reprimand that becomes part of the official record of this school, and the ministry has been informed." He paused. "I will retain my position. That outcome was not certain, and I want to be clear that I did not consider it my primary concern during the proceedings." "What was your primary concern?" "That the inquiry be honest," Dumbledore said. "I gave the governors a full account of everything I knew, everything I was told by Poppy, every decision I made and the reasoning I used to justify it. All of it." He looked at the lake. "I found the experience, not comfortable, but necessary. Rather like a surgery, I imagine. Unpleasant in the process and clarifying afterward." Harry said nothing. "I want to tell you something," Dumbledore said, "that I have not said yet in any official capacity, and that I want to say to you specifically, not to a board or an inquiry or a court." He turned to look at Harry directly. "What was done to you was wrong. Not merely inadequate, or regrettable, or a difficult situation imperfectly managed. Wrong. And my failure to act on what I knew made me complicit in it. I am not going to offer you the reasoning again, because you've already heard it and you were right when you identified it as fear dressed as wisdom. I'm simply going to say that I was wrong, and that I am sorry." The lake moved. The second-years had lost their paper boat to a slight breeze and were arguing about it. Harry looked at the water for a long moment. He thought about being 5, and 6, and 7, and about the specific quality of silence in a cupboard under the stairs at night. He thought about letters addressed to the cupboard under the stairs, which had been the first proof he'd ever had that someone outside number 4 knew that was where he slept. He thought about walking into Hogwarts for the first time at 11 and feeling, in the bones of the old building, that he was somewhere that knew him. He thought about Dumbledore. About everything he was, and everything he wasn't, and how both of those things were true simultaneously without canceling each other out. "I know you're sorry," Harry said. "I believed you the first time." "Then, it doesn't fix it," Harry said. "I want to be honest about that. The sorry, it matters. But it doesn't fix what happened, and I don't think you should expect it to, or expect me to tell you it does." "No," Dumbledore said quietly. "I don't expect that." "But I'm not," Harry stopped, finding the word. "I'm not carrying it at you anymore," he said finally. "Whatever I was feeling before, at you, at the situation, at the fact that everyone knew and nothing happened. I'm not dragging that around pointed at you. It was real and it happened and you were part of why it continued, and that's just true. But he looked at the lake. "I've got other things to do." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "You have." "Voldemort's building an army," Harry said, in the same tone he'd used to say it to Ron in the common room in December. "Matter of fact, because that was what it was. Umbridge is making this school worse every week she's in it. I've got OWLs in 3 months and Quidditch and the DA." He paused. "I've got a lot of things to do." "You do," Dumbledore said. "May I ask, how are you?" Harry considered it. "Better," he said. "Properly better, not the kind I used to say just to not have a conversation." "I'm glad." "I know." Harry looked at him. "You're not a villain," he said. "I think you know that's not what I think. You're someone who made choices I don't agree with, for reasons that were real but wrong, and who's going to have to live with that. So will I, but for different reasons. He picked up a stone from the grass and turned it over in his hands. I think that's about as resolved as this gets. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across his face that Harry had only seen there occasionally, not the wise serenity that was his usual mode, but something underneath it, something more tired and more genuine. Your mother, he said, would have been furious with me. Yeah, Harry said. She would have. Your father would also have been furious, but would have expressed it much more loudly. Harry almost smiled. Yeah. They would both, Dumbledore said, have been extraordinarily proud of you. Harry looked at the lake. He let himself feel that, actually feel it, without the usual deflection, without the armor that came down automatically when someone said something about his parents. He let it land and stay. I know, he said. I think I know that. He put the stone down. The second years had given up on the paper boat and were throwing pebbles into the shallows instead. The afternoon light was going that particular gold that meant late afternoon in spring and meant the world was briefly exactly as beautiful as it was capable of being. The conversation had reached its natural end, which was not a resolution but was a completion, the point where everything that needed to be said had been said and what remained was just the fact of going forward. Harry understood that as clearly as he understood anything. He stood up. Brushed grass off his jeans. Professor, he said. Dumbledore looked up. The DA, Harry said. I need somewhere to practice. Somewhere Umbridge can't find. I don't suppose you know of anything like that. The smallest pause. I believe, Dumbledore said, with something close to his usual tone, that the castle occasionally makes available certain rooms to students who have genuine need of them. The 7th floor corridor, opposite the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy, has been known to be particularly responsive. Right, Harry said. Good to know. He walked back toward the castle with the afternoon sun at his back, and did not look behind him, and felt the ground solid underfoot the whole way. The letter from Dudley arrived on a Saturday morning in March, 6 weeks after Harry had written back to him. The gap had not surprised him. Dudley was not a writer and had never been, and finding words for things was not something he'd been raised to value. The fact that he'd written back at all was what mattered. Harry read it at breakfast, alone at the far end of the Gryffindor table with his tea and his toast, in the comfortable early morning quiet before the hall filled properly. The letter was 3 pages. For Dudley, this was approximately the literary equivalent of a novel. He wrote about the sentencing, which he'd attended. He wrote about his father's face when the sentence was read, and about how he hadn't felt what he'd expected to feel, which was relief. Instead he'd felt something complicated that he was still figuring out. He wrote about his mother, carefully, without quite knowing what to say about her, and Harry read those paragraphs and understood the difficulty because he felt it too. He wrote about school, about how things were different now, not dramatically, not in ways he could fully explain, but different. He'd started noticing things, he said. Things he'd always not noticed, the way you not notice things you decided not to look at. Kids in his year who were having a hard time. The mechanics of how his group operated, who it included and who it didn't and why. He hadn't done anything about any of it yet. He didn't know what to do. But he was noticing. I know this doesn't make up for anything, he wrote near the end, in the blocky, effortful print that Harry had now learned to read as the way Dudley wrote when he was being careful. I'm not saying it does. I just thought you should know that I'm trying to figure out how to be a different kind of person than I was. I don't really know how yet. But I'm trying. And then, on the last line, set apart from the rest of the paragraph in a way that suggested it had taken a while to write, I hope you're okay. I think you probably are. You always seemed like you'd be okay eventually, even when things were really bad. I don't know why I thought that. But I did. Harry folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of his robes, next to where Marcia's business card still lived, a habit he'd developed and hadn't broken. He looked at his toast. He wasn't quite sure what he felt, which he'd come to accept was sometimes the appropriate response to complicated things. Not every feeling needed naming immediately. Sometimes you just carried it for a while until it found its own shape. He ate his toast and drank his tea and watched the hall fill up around him, and thought about writing back. The Weasley guardianship was finalized in the third week of March. He found out officially through a letter from Arthur, written on Muggle notepaper in Arthur's enthusiastic, slightly sprawling hand, with a ministry stamp in the corner that had been applied crookedly and looked exactly like something Arthur had done himself on a kitchen table. The letter said that the family court had approved the arrangement, that Carol from Children's Services had submitted a positive report, and that effective immediately, Harry James Potter was under the formal legal care of Arthur and Molly Weasley. There was a hand-drawn sketch of the burrow at the bottom, annotated with small arrows pointing to various features, one of which said your window with an arrow pointing to an upstairs room. Harry stared at that for a long time. He wrote back that afternoon. He wrote several drafts, which was unusual for him. He was not, in general, a writer of drafts. The first draft had too much gratitude in it, the performed kind that didn't quite mean anything. The second was too brief and looked like he didn't care. The third was just right, honest, direct, a little clumsy, genuinely felt. He thanked them. He said he was looking forward to the summer. He said, and this was the part he rewrote the most, that having a place that was actually his, with people who actually wanted him there, was something he'd been thinking about for most of his life, and that he didn't quite have the words for what it meant to have it now, but that he thought they probably understood even if he didn't say it perfectly. He sent it with the school owl and felt lighter for the rest of the day in a way he couldn't entirely account for. Hermione found him in the library that evening. This was not unusual, she found him in the library regularly. What was slightly unusual was that she wasn't carrying her own books. She sat down across from him without preamble and put her elbows on the table. Philip from Ravenclaw told me something today, she said. About the inquiry? About Umbridge. Specifically about what she's been doing with the governors. She looked at him steadily. She's been filing reports about the DA. Harry looked up from his textbook. She knows about the DA. She suspects. She doesn't have proof. Hermione's expression was the careful one. But she's been building a case. She's been noting absences, monitoring common room schedules, and she has a list of students she thinks are involved. She's going to make a move soon. Harry closed his textbook. He thought about the room of requirement, which had become the DA's home, the room that appeared when you needed it, that Dumbledore had quietly pointed him toward, that had been warm and large and full of people learning to defend themselves for 4 months now. He thought about the 30-odd people who came there every week and worked hard and trusted him. How soon, he said. Before Easter, Philip thinks. Harry looked at the table for a moment. Then we need to move first, he said. Hermione nodded slowly. I was thinking the same thing. If she makes the accusation, we're reactive. If we do something before she has the chance, we expose it ourselves, Harry said. On our terms. Hermione blinked. That's actually, yes. That's exactly right. She leaned forward. Right to the Quibbler. Luna's father would publish it immediately. A full account of what the DA is, what we're doing, why we're doing it, and who's been blocking legitimate defense against the dark arts education. She paused. Take the story away from her before she can tell her version of it. Harry thought about the interview Rita Skeeter had done with Hermione in the dragon tent at the Triwizard Tournament, the one that had ended up in the Quibbler because the Prophet wouldn't touch it, and that had shifted public opinion in a single week. He thought about Luna's father, who had proven in February that he knew how to use accurate information to devastating effect. I'll write it tonight, Harry said. We should all write it, Hermione said. You, me, Ron. Maybe Neville. Multiple voices. She was already thinking, her eyes going slightly unfocused in the way they did when she was constructing an argument. It needs to be factual. No drama. Just, this is what we've been doing, this is why we've been doing it, this is what's been wrong with the official curriculum. She looked at Harry. You know what this is, right? This is the same thing as the records. He looked at her. You found a legitimate mechanism, she said. A real one, outside the system that was failing you. And you used it. She met his eyes. That's what this is too. We use what's available. We go to the public, to the quibbler, before Umbridge can control the narrative. We take the story. Harry was quiet for a moment. He thought about an envelope going through a slot in a post office in Hogsmeade on a Saturday morning in October, and the feeling of a lock turning. Yeah, he said. Let's do it. They wrote it together that night, the four of them, Harry and Hermione and Ron and Neville, in the corner of the common room after midnight, with Ginny contributing edits from the armchair where she was ostensibly doing homework but was clearly listening to everything. The piece went through 7 versions and ended up at 3 pages, factual, direct, written in Harry's name with the others cited. It described Umbridge's curriculum, the lack of practical instruction, the students' response, and what the DA had been doing every week since October. It did not mention Voldemort's return, that would be its own piece, Harry decided, for its own time. But it mentioned that students preparing for a world with real threats needed real preparation, and that when the official curriculum failed to provide that, students had a right to seek it themselves. Neville read the final version and said, "It's good." Then, after a pause, "It's actually really good." Ron sent it to Luna the next morning, who sent it to her father, who published it in the next issue of the Quibbler, which landed on doorsteps and owl perches the following Thursday. Umbridge read it in the staff room at breakfast, and the sound she made, according to Seamus who had been walking past at the time, was remarkable. Harry did not hear it. He was eating breakfast in the Great Hall, reading the same issue, and feeling, for the second time in 5 months, like someone who had taken a situation by the collar and directed it rather than simply surviving it. The Easter holidays came, and Harry went to the Burrow. This was not the first time he'd been to the Burrow. He'd spent parts of several previous summers there, and Christmas, and various other refuges from Privet Drive. But it was different now. Walking through the front door on the first evening of Easter break, with his trunk in the hallway and the kitchen smelling of the specific Weasley alchemy of food and warmth and organized chaos, it was different because it was his. Not in the sense that he owned any of it. In the sense that it was his home, officially, on paper, with Arthur's signature and a family court stamp and Carol from Children's Services positive report. His home. Molly hugged him in the kitchen doorway in the comprehensive way she had of hugging people, as though the hug itself were a form of argument she was winning conclusively, and said, "You're too thin again," which was technically true because the stress of February had not helped his appetite, and which Harry had come to understand was her way of saying "You're here and I'm glad." "I'll fix that," she said, in the tone of someone issuing a personal challenge to his nutritional state. Arthur shook his hand and then pulled him into a hug too, which was slightly less practiced than Molly's but no less genuine, and said, "Welcome home, Harry," very quietly, just to him, in the way of a man who had chosen each word deliberately and meant all of them. Harry stood in the Weasley kitchen on the first evening of Easter break, with the wireless playing something cheerful and the smell of dinner building on the stove and Fred and George arguing about something in the garden and Ginny's voice from upstairs and Ron already raiding the biscuit tin, and let it be real. Let himself be there, fully, without the defensive mechanism that had always kicked in before, the part of him that preempted loss by holding good things at a slight distance, so they couldn't hurt as much when they were taken away. He didn't hold it at a distance. He let it in. It was warm. The kitchen was warm, the house was warm, the evening was warm in the way of early April when the world was beginning to mean it. He sat down at the kitchen table and Molly put a plate in front of him before dinner was technically ready because she had clearly decided he needed feeding immediately, and he ate it, and it was as good as it always was, and he sat in the noise and the warmth and was present for all of it. He went to his room that night, his room, and the possessive still felt strange in his mouth in the best possible way, and sat on the bed that had a quilt Molly had clearly made specifically, in Gryffindor colors, and looked at the window and the spring night outside. He thought about the year. He tried to hold the whole thing at once, the way you sometimes try to hold a whole piece of music, not every note, but the shape of it, the arc, the way it had moved. October, a file in a hospital wing, and a decision made in an afternoon. November, a letter through a post office slot, and the feeling of a lock turning. December, a police visit at Privet Drive. A growing case. A governor's inquiry beginning. Dumbledore sitting without his desk between them. January, the motion denied, the case confirmed. The Burrow as home in paperwork, the Burrow as home in practice. Arthur reading the children act. February, the 4th of February. A magistrate's court in Guildford. The medical records read into evidence. Pomfrey's voice saying no action recorded 5 times. Vernon's color draining as Okafor asked him about the lock. Petunia's composure slipping, just once, just for a moment, and what had been underneath it. The witness box, and coming down from it. Guilty. 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 March, the sentencing. The Quibbler piece. Dumbledore by the lake. Dudley's letter. The guardianship finalized. His room at the Burrow with his name on it in Molly's handwriting on a floor plan sketch. The shape of it was, he tried to find the right word and landed eventually on, deliberate. It was the shape of someone who had decided something and followed it, all the way through, without letting it be taken from them. He had done that. All of it had started with him. He got up and went to the window. The Weasley garden was dark below, the gnomes presumably sleeping, the vegetable patch doing its spring thing. The sky above the Ottery St. Catchpole countryside was dark and clear and scattered with stars. He thought about what Hermione had said in the library. You found a legitimate mechanism. A real one, outside the system that was failing you. Yes. He had. And the thing he understood now, sitting at the window at the end of a very long year, was that this was a skill. Not just a thing he'd done once but a thing he could do, identify the mechanism, use what was available, go outside the failing system when the system failed. He had done it with the records and he had done it with the Quibbler piece, and there would be other things, other situations, other moments when the official channel was compromised or corrupt or simply insufficient. He would find the mechanism. He would use it. He understood, too, something about himself that he hadn't understood as clearly before, that the courage people kept telling him he had was not the absence of fear. It was never that. It was the specific capacity to be afraid of something and decide to do it anyway, because some things mattered more than self-protection. He had always known that, in the abstract way of someone who had been in enough dangerous situations to understand it practically. What was different now was that he'd applied it to himself. Not to a basilisk or a dragon or a graveyard. To himself, to his own history, to the 10 years in a cupboard and everything that had followed from them. He had decided that he mattered enough to fight for. That was not a small thing. He thought it might be the most important thing he'd done, more important than any of the things people wrote about in newspapers, more important than the scar on his forehead and everything it supposedly meant. He had decided he was worth it. And then he had proved it. He was still at the window when a tap on the glass made him jump. Hedwig was there, on the outside sill, looking at him with the expression she had when she'd flown a long way and was unimpressed about it. She had a letter tied to her leg. He opened the window. She came in and landed on the bedpost and submitted to being stroked with the tolerance of someone accepting a courtesy she considered her due. The letter was from Marsh. He hadn't expected one. They'd spoken after the sentencing and it had felt like an ending, warm but complete, the professional relationship concluded. But he opened it and read it in the light from the window. It was short. Harry, I thought you might want to know, the physical examination report and the documentation from your case have been submitted to Surrey Children's Services as a case study in the use of school medical records as corroborating evidence in safeguarding proceedings. It may change how cases like yours are handled in the future. How seriously institutional flags are taken, and followed up. I thought you'd want to know that what you did is making a difference beyond your own case. It already has. I also thought you'd want to know that Dudley has been in contact with our family support team voluntarily. He's getting some help working through things. He asked me to tell you. Take care of yourself. Claire Marsh, DS, Surrey Police PS, the solicitor who tried to get the records excluded sent a very pained letter to our office last month conceding that the 1997 precedent was correctly cited. I thought you'd enjoy knowing that. Harry sat down on the bed and read it twice. He thought about other children. Other files. Other healers' flags sitting in other folders, sent to other desks, met with other silences. He thought about the phrase no action recorded and what it would mean if, because of a letter posted in a Hogsmeade post office on a Saturday morning, that phrase happened less often. He thought about that for a while. Then he folded the letter and put it in his pocket with Dudley's letter and Marsh's business card and lay back on the Gryffindor quilt in his room at the Burrow, and looked at the ceiling, and let it all be real. The term that followed was, in Harry's honest assessment, sitting in Hermione's careful word, eventful. The DA grew. Umbrage escalated, then overreached, then fell, in the specific and satisfying way of people who had based their entire strategy on controlling information and found themselves facing people who had learned to rout around them. The Ministry's grip on Hogwarts began to slip. Dumbledore remained, censured but present, more honest with Harry than he had ever been, still infuriating in his tendency to hold information close but visibly, consciously trying to correct it. Voldemort remained. That war was coming and Harry knew it with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had been in a graveyard in June and seen what was there. The DA was partly about defense against the dark arts and partly about preparing for what they all knew was coming, and Harry taught it with the seriousness it deserved, not afraid of what was ahead, but clear-eyed about it. Those were separate things, the war and this year. They existed in the same life but they were not the same story. One was about Harry and the world, about prophecy and politics and the weight of being the person a war had decided to pivot around. The other was about Harry himself, the 10 years before Hogwarts, the file in the hospital wing, the decision in the library, the letter through the post office slot. He kept both things clearly separated in his mind. He refused to let the weight of the first erase what the second had meant. In June, on the last evening before the end-of-year exams, Harry walked to the lake alone. Not anxiously. Just to be there. The June evening was long and warm, the light lasting well past 8, the lake flat and bright in the late sun. The grounds were mostly empty, exam season had everyone inside with their notes and their anxiety, and the peace of the outdoor world was almost aggressive in its beauty. He sat at the water's edge and put his feet in the grass and looked out at the surface of the lake, which held the sky in it like a mirror. He could see the castle reflected in it, inverted and perfect. He thought about all of it. Not cataloguing it, not reviewing it. Just sitting with it, the whole year, letting it be what it had been. He thought about October and the file, and the specific quality of the silence in Pomfrey's storeroom. He thought about the envelope in Hermione's handwriting going through the slot. He thought about the letter on Privet Drive headed notepaper, Surrey Police, Child Protection Unit. He thought about the room in Holborn with the recorder on the table, and saying his whole story from start to finish for the first time in his life, to someone whose job was to hear it. He thought about Guilford. He thought about coming down from the witness box. He thought about his room at the Burrow with the Gryffindor quilt. He thought about Dudley, trying to figure out how to be a different kind of person. He thought about Marsh's letter, and case studies, and other children's files, and flags that might now be followed up. He thought about Dumbledore by the lake in March, saying I was wrong, with no caveats and no wisdom dressing. Just wrong. He thought about being 1 year old and left on a doorstep, and being 15 and deciding, deliberately, to leave the doorstep behind. The lake held the sky. The evening was long and warm and generous. He thought about his mum, and what McGonagall had said, I believe she would find this correct, and let himself feel the truth of that without immediately moving on from it. He let himself miss her, and miss his father, and feel the specific grief of people you never knew but who had loved you absolutely, and let that grief be what it was, not a wound, not a weapon, just the shape that love made when the person it came from was gone. He sat with it all until the light began to change, until the lake went from bright to gold to the particular deep blue of midsummer dusk. Then he heard footsteps in the grass behind him and turned. Ron and Hermione were coming across the grounds toward him, two familiar shapes in the long evening light, Ron's red hair catching the last of the sun, Hermione's bag swinging at her shoulder because she had almost certainly brought revision materials to an outdoor sunset walk without noticing she'd done it. "We've been looking for you for 20 minutes, Ron called, while still 20 feet away. "I was here," Harry said. "Obviously." Ron dropped down onto the grass next to him. "What are you doing?" "Nothing," Harry said. "Thinking. About OWLs?" "No." "About Voldemort?" "No." Ron looked at him. "About this year?" "Yeah," Harry said. "About this year." Hermione sat on his other side and set her bag down, and did not take out any revision materials, which meant she was paying attention. She looked at the lake. "It was a lot," she said. "It was," Harry agreed. "Are you okay?" He'd been asking himself that question, and being asked it by other people, for years, and he'd answered it the same way for years: "Fine, yeah, I'm fine," and then somewhere in the autumn, in Marsh's interview room, he'd unlearned that answer and replaced it with something more honest. "Yeah," he said. "I actually am." He said it the same way he'd said it to Ron after the sentencing, in the common room by the fire with the butterbeer and the sandwiches from Molly, not as performance, not as reassurance, but as a factual report on his actual state. He was okay. He was better than okay. He was in the middle of a life that was his, that he had fought for, that was full of people who chose to be in it. "Good," Hermione said simply. "Yeah," Ron said, and reached forward to pick up a flat stone from the water's edge, and send it skipping out across the lake's surface, 1, 2, 3, for skips before it went under. 3 points for form, Harry said. "For skips, mate. At least 4 points. Your elbow was wrong." "My elbow was perfect." "Was it, Hermione?" Harry said. "Elbow was fine," Hermione said, absently, watching the ripples. "Ha," said Ron. The ripples spread out in perfect circles and faded, and the lake went smooth again, and the sky above the highlands went deep blue and then violet, and then the first stars came through, the same stars Harry had looked at from the astronomy tower in October, the same distance and depth. He looked at them for a while. He thought that the difference between surviving and living was this: surviving was the water pipe in the cupboard and the bolt on the outside of the door and the specific mathematics of how little you needed to get through the next day. Living was the lake in June and the Gryffindor quilt and Arthur's sketch with your window written in small careful letters. Living was being here, fully, without holding it at a distance. He was doing that. He was here.